Hey guys, tonight we begin with the quiet and measured world of early America, where life was marked not by the clock, but by the slow turning of the seasons. A world where the rhythm of each day was dictated by the rising sun, the needs of the animals, and the steady labor of the soil. It may seem distant now, but for countless families, this was reality. A life of patience, repetition, and resilience. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how these stories reach across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe let a candle flicker, or a fan hum in the background. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's set the scene. The world of the colonial American farmer began not with the ringing of a clock or the strike of a bell, but with the long exhalation of the land itself. As night faded and the first uncertain streaks of pale light stretched across the horizon, the countryside of 17th and 18th century America was expansive and slow to stir. For most of the colonies, farms spread across cleared fields bordered by woods that seemed endless, a constant reminder of the wilderness that had only recently been pushed back to make space for homes and crops. The fields were irregular in shape, the product of steady clearing rather than neat design, with stones piled into crude walls, split-rail fences set in uneven lines, and hedgerows that served to separate one man's work from his neighbor's. The homestead sat quietly at the center of this patchwork. Most houses were modest wooden structures, single-room or two-room dwellings, hewn from timber cut on the land itself. Roofs were made of shingles or thatch, small windows were covered in oiled paper, or in wealthier homes, glass panes imported at high cost. The chimneys, built from field stone or brick when it could be afforded, stood as the central feature, their presence essential to warmth and survival. Surrounding the home were the outbuildings, a barn for livestock, a shed for tools, perhaps a smokehouse for meat, and small pens for pigs and chickens. The arrangement was practical, rather than decorative, laid out in such a way as to minimize the distance a farmer or his family would need to walk in the biting cold of winter or in the sweltering heat of summer. Before the farmer awoke, the land itself seemed to breathe in silence. There was the faint rustling of trees along the edge of the forest, the indistinct hum of insects, and in the summer months the first bird song stirring as the sky lightened. At the margins of fields, dew gathered on grasses, coating each blade with a sheen that would soon vanish under the rising sun. To modern eyes, this was a quiet too complete, almost unnerving. But for the farmer it was the natural soundscape of life, the land in its unhurried preparation for the labor that each day would demand. Colonial farms varied in scale. In New England, the rocky soil yielded smaller plots, and subsistence farming was the norm. Families grew enough to feed themselves, and sometimes a little more to sell or trade, but the fields were rarely expansive, and the work was always demanding. Farther south, in colonies like Virginia and Maryland, the land stretched wider, the soil richer, and tobacco or grain farms could be larger enterprises. Yet regardless of region, most farmers lived closely tied to the land they worked, their existence dependent on what they could coax from the soil and store before the lean months of winter. The dawn light falling across a New England cornfield was different from the haze lifting over a Virginian tobacco field, yet the underlying rhythm was the same, the beginning of another day in which survival was the quiet purpose. The landscape bore the marks of both new beginnings and ancient presences. Forests still pressed close on many settlements, and Native American trails crisscrossed the countryside. Even as colonial fields expanded, farmers often cleared stumps and stones year after year, making land arable bit by bit. Each spring, fire might be used to open new ground, its smoke lingering in the cool morning air. Over time, cleared land began to shape the countryside into a mosaic of cultivation, meadow and woodland. These spaces were not purely aesthetic but practical, serving as grazing land for cattle, sources of timber, and reserves for hunting, when food supplies thinned. As dawn broadened, the quiet homestead became a world of layered tasks waiting to be undertaken. Chickens would soon need to be let from their coops, cattle driven to pasture, and water drawn from wells or nearby creeks. Yet in this first moment of day, Before doors creaked open and footsteps scuffed the packed earth, the farm remained still. The land was both adversary and ally. Crops failed as often as they flourished. Drought, blight, or early frost could erase months of labor. Yet the farmer returned to the soil without hesitation, for the earth was the only constant companion, the measure of his existence. There was no sharp separation between wilderness and settlement, no clear boundary between cultivated order and untamed growth. Wolves still prowled at the edges of fields in earlier colonial decades. Deer and smaller game frequently strayed into gardens or corn patches. The farmer's world was permeable, with the forest always threatening to reclaim cleared land if left untended. This created a rhythm of vigilance, not just of planting and harvest, but of continual maintenance. Fences rebuilt, weeds cut back, boundaries reinforced against the relentless encroachment of nature. The dawn was also a reminder of time's slow march. Without clocks in most households, the farmer measured his days by the sun's rise and fall, and by the tasks suited to each light. Almanacs, which grew popular in colonial America, provided guidance on weather patterns, planting schedules and celestial observations, but in the earliest hours of day, the farmer relied only on his senses, the changing light, the calls of birds, the smell of damp soil. These cues told him as much as any written chart could, grounding him in a rhythm that was at once personal and universal. Even in its stillness, the dawn of a colonial farm was not empty. It was heavy with potential work, the mending of a plowshare, the tending of seedlings, the milking of cows, the endless repetition of motions that sustained life. Each day began anew with this quiet acknowledgement of what lay ahead. For the colonial farmer, there was little anticipation of leisure. Dawn was not the promise of possibility, but the marker of necessity. The land awaited, and with it a day of unbroken effort. Thus, the scene is set, a small wooden house standing at the center of its modest fields, the air cool and damp, the light stretching slowly across fences and stone walls, and the farmer yet to rise from his bed. Around him, the land held its breath, prepared once again to receive the toil that defined existence in colonial America. This was the constant backdrop of life, the unchanging rhythm of dawn and the quiet insistence of the land that it must be worked. Within the modest wooden farmhouse, the day began not with sudden movement, but with the slow stirring of bodies accustomed to the weight of long labor, and the pull of sleep shortened by necessity. The air inside was cool, sometimes damp, for the warmth of the hearth had ebbed during the night. Smoke that had lingered from the last fire clung faintly to the beams, mingling with the earthy smell of packed dirt floors or rough wooden planks. The first light entered hesitantly, filtering through small windows, often covered not with glass but with oiled paper or thin fabric that allowed only a softened glow. In wealthier households, panes of glass might catch the sun in fractured patterns, but for most, the house remained dim until the fire was coaxed back to life. The interiors of colonial farmhouses were marked by simplicity and necessity. A single room might serve as kitchen, living space and sleeping quarters. Larger families, or those of greater means, might have divided rooms, a loft above for children, or a separate chamber for parents. The furniture was sparse, a rough-hewn table, benches or stools, perhaps a chair with a woven seat. Beds were often simple frames strung with rope or rawhide, supporting a mattress stuffed with straw, corn husks, or in more fortunate homes, feathers. Over time, the ropes sagged, and the common phrase, "sleep tight," came to refer to the need to tighten them again before rest. As morning deepened, the family rose in subdued order. Children, often sharing a loft or trundle bed, were stirred by the rustling of their parents, or the faint sounds of animals outside, waiting to be tended. Sleep was rarely indulgent. The light of dawn signaled responsibility more than repose. Even in the smallest houses, a rhythm developed, a sequence of movements that repeated itself each day. Someone, often the mother or an older child, would bend to the hearth, stirring the embers preserved overnight beneath ashes, coaxing them with careful breaths, until the fire flared once more. The crackle of rekindled flame marked the true beginning of the day. The hearth dominated the farmhouse, both physically and symbolically. It provided warmth, light, and the means of cooking every meal. Suspended over it, an iron pot might be left from the night before, holding remnants of porridge or stew, to be warmed again in the morning. Simple foods greeted the day: cornmeal mush, bread baked in advance, perhaps butter or cheese made in previous days, sometimes supplemented with salted pork or eggs gathered fresh. The flavors were plain but sustaining, nourishment measured less by variety than by quantity and reliability. The farmhouse was not silent, though it was subdued. The creak of floorboards, the low murmur of voices, the clatter of iron against iron as pots were shifted, the rustle of cloth as garments were pulled on, all blended into a muted symphony of daily life. The sounds of the household echoed the routine of necessity. Children, once roused, might be sent immediately to small tasks, bringing in wood for the fire, carrying water from a nearby well, or helping to sweep the hearth free of ash. Every pair of hands mattered, and even the youngest were drawn into the fabric of labor. The garments worn each morning were functional, not ornamental. Farmers and their families wore wool or linen, homespun, if they could not afford imported cloth. Colors were muted, dyed with local plants into shades of brown, blue, or grey. Men rose into breeches, shirts, and waistcoats, women into shifts, aprons, and simple bodices. These were not clothes for display, but for wear against dirt, sweat, and weather. Repair was constant, patches sewn in place, tears mended by lamplight, fabric stretched to last another season. Within the house, mornings were also shaped by the cold in winter, or the heat in summer. In the colder months, the first priority was warmth. Fires had to be fed, and families often rose fully clothed, having slept in layers to ward off the chill. In the summer, the air within the farmhouse was heavy and still, and rising early offered a chance to work before the sun grew oppressive. Each season imposed its character on the morning routine, but the underlying rhythm remained unaltered: rise, rekindle, eat, begin. The farmhouse interior carried with it a sense of permanence despite its imperfection. Walls might be rough timber, sometimes plastered with a mixture of clay and straw to seal gaps against drafts. Roof beams loomed overhead, often visible, blackened slightly by years of smoke. The floor might be swept but rarely polished, a place worn smooth by countless steps. The smell of wood, smoke, and earth was constant, not unpleasant but grounding, a reminder of the house's closeness to the materials of the land. Religious practice often marked the morning as well, for many colonial families carried strong habits of devotion. A passage of scripture might be read aloud, or prayers offered before breakfast. These acts were not interruptions but woven into the routine just as natural as feeding animals or splitting kindling. They reflected a worldview in which daily life, labor, and faith were inseparable, each reinforcing the other in the slow unfolding of time. As the meal was eaten, simple and quiet, the tasks of the day were already considered. The farmer would soon move outside, to fields awaiting ploughing or planting, to fences requiring mending, or to animals needing care. The mother would tend the garden, spin thread, or oversee children in their chores. Each task lay ahead with certainty, and the morning meal was less a pause than a moment of transition, the final step before stepping into the broader labor of the land. The farmhouse itself, with its dim interior and its morning stirrings, was more than shelter. It was the nucleus of survival. Its walls held not comfort in the modern sense, but security against wind, rain, and snow. Its hearth gave life to food, warmth, and light. Its interior bore the marks of countless repetitions, of mornings begun in nearly identical fashion, where the day was greeted not with novelty, but with necessity. The subdued start of tasks, the quiet preparation, the rising from sleep into labor, these were the constants of colonial existence, repeated across thousands of homesteads, each one both unique in detail and uniform in rhythm. Thus, as the family moved through the first hours of day, the house itself seemed to awaken. The crackle of fire, the clatter of dishes, the muffled footsteps of children descending from lofts, all were signals that another day had begun. Beyond the door lay the expanse of fields and forests, But within these walls, the measured and subdued order of morning prepared the family for the endless cycle of work that stretched outward into the land. In the measured quiet of the farmstead, before the day's labor unfolded across the fields, the farmer's thoughts often turned toward the implements that connected him to the soil. These tools, simple in appearance yet essential in function, were the extensions of his hands and arms, the mediators between human endurance and the resistance of the earth. Without them, the farmer's labor would remain unshaped effort. With them, the land could be turned, seeded, weeded, and harvested in a slow but steady rhythm that stretched across the year. The tools of a colonial American farmer were rarely extravagant, nor were they the products of idle innovation. Most had ancient origins, their forms refined over centuries of agricultural practice stretching back to Europe and beyond. The hoe, the scythe, the plough, these were instruments recognizable to farmers of antiquity, carried across the Atlantic, not in their physical form alone, but in the inherited memory of how they were to be used, repaired, and valued. Yet in the colonies, these implements took on new meaning, for they were often scarce, costly, and difficult to replace. Each tool had to last, and when it failed, the farmer did not discard it lightly, but returned it to usefulness through patience and repair. The plough was perhaps the most important of all. In its simplest colonial form, it consisted of a wooden frame, reinforced with iron, where the soil cut deepest. Larger and wealthier farms might possess heavier ploughs with iron shares, but for many, the plough remained modest, drawn by oxen or horses when available, or pushed and guided by human strength when animals were lacking. The ploughshare turned the soil, breaking it open for planting, its passage leaving behind the furrows that promised a season's harvest. To watch a plough at work was to see the earth transformed from resistant sod to ordered rows, a process as old as agriculture itself, yet newly demanding on each patch of cleared colonial ground. Alongside the plough stood the hoe, the most versatile and ubiquitous of tools. With its simple blade fixed to a long handle, the hoe was indispensable in weeding, shaping rows, and tending the spaces between plants. Its rhythm was slow and repetitive, a swing, a strike, the soft scrape of soil pushed aside. This sound was common in the fields, carried across the rows as multiple hands worked in unison. Though simple, the hoe required strength in its wielding and attentiveness in its upkeep. The wooden handle had to be smoothed to prevent splinters, the iron edge sharpened against a whetstone to ensure efficiency. The scythe and the sickle formed another category of vital instruments. With the scythe, its long curved blade and wooden snath, the farmer cut grass for hay, sweeping in wide arcs that left stalks falling in neat, flattened rows. The sickle, smaller and crescent-shaped, was suited to reaping grain. Each grasp and cut a patient harvesting of stalks that would be gathered and bound into sheaves. These tools, though demanding, represented the point at which the farmer's labor touched most directly the promise of sustenance, the gathering of food for animals, the securing of grain for bread. Each stroke, slow and deliberate, carried with it the weight of necessity. Axes and hatchets were equally constant companions. Before fields could be cultivated, trees had to be felled, stumps removed, and wood prepared for building or for fuel. The axe was more than a tool of the field, it was the instrument by which the farmer claimed his land from the wilderness, shaping both his homestead and his daily existence. Its edge required careful attention. A dull axe slowed progress, increased danger, and wasted effort. Thus, sharpening was a regular task, often carried out in quiet moments by the hearth or in the cool shade of a barn. The maintenance of tools was itself a form of labor, slow and necessary. Iron implements dulled and rusted if neglected, their surfaces requiring oiling, their edges constant attention. Wooden handles cracked, loosened, or splintered, demanding replacement or repair. The farmer, though not a trained smith, often acquired enough skill to rehaft an axe, to patch a broken plough, or to bind together a tool whose usefulness might otherwise be lost. For more complex repairs, a blacksmith was indispensable, and a trip to the smithy with worn ironwork was part of the cycle of rural life. Yet even then, the farmer bore responsibility for daily care. Tools were not left exposed to weather, nor set aside thoughtlessly after work. They were stored carefully, leaned against walls, hung from pegs, or laid beneath shelter, ready to be taken up again with the next day's dawn. Patience was the defining quality of this relationship between farmer and tool. Unlike the immediacy of labor in the field, maintenance required foresight, a recognition that time given now would preserve time and effort later. A plow oiled in the evening saved labor in the spring. A blade sharpened by lamplight meant fewer wasted strokes in the harvest. These quiet acts of preparation formed an invisible layer of the farmer's toil, unseen in the field yet crucial to its success. The craftsmanship of these implements spoke to a world in which function outweighed embellishment. Most tools bore no ornament beyond the grain of wood or the curve of iron. They were valued not for appearance but for endurance, their worth measured in seasons of service. Yet within their simplicity lay a kind of beauty, the austere elegance of form following function, the balance of weight and shape honed not for display but for utility. In the hand of the farmer, a hoe or a sickle became an extension of his will, and in this union of tool and labor lay the quiet dignity of agrarian life. Tools also shaped the pace of labor. The sweep of a scythe was not hurried but measured, requiring steady rhythm more than sudden speed. The swing of an axe demanded precision, not haste. The plow moved forward at the pace of animals, slow and deliberate, each furrow laid down as if by patient design. These rhythms imposed themselves upon the farmer, teaching him the virtue of endurance over swiftness, the necessity of repeating motions without expectation of immediate completion. In this way, tools were not merely instruments but teachers, setting the tempo of a life measured by seasons rather than moments. Thus, as the morning advanced and the farmer turned toward the fields, his tools in hand, there was a quiet recognition of dependence. The land could not be worked without them, and they could not endure without him. Together, they formed a partnership of necessity, as constant and unyielding as the turning of the earth itself. In their weight, their sharpness, their wear, the farmer read the history of his own labor, and in their maintenance, he glimpsed the continuation of his family's survival. Spring was the season that determined all others, the moment when the farmer's careful preparation, his tools and his patience converged in the act of planting. The earth, softened by thaw and rain, opened itself reluctantly to the plow, and in those furrows the farmer placed his hope for the months to come. The rhythm of planting was not hurried but deliberate, a series of gestures repeated year after year, each small motion a thread in the fabric of survival. The colonial American farmer lived by cycles more dependable than clocks and calendars. The position of the sun, the greening of trees, the thaw of rivers, and the calls of migrating birds all spoke of time's progression. Spring, with its softened soil and longer light, was recognized less as a date on a page than as a change in air, a dampness underfoot, a smell of earth turned raw again. The farmer's senses, attuned to these signals, told him when to begin. To plant too early risked frost, to plant too late risked hunger. Between those dangers lay the narrow window that defined the year. Grain was often the first priority. Wheat, rye and barley, carried from Europe and adapted to American soil, became the backbone of fields across the colonies. In New England, where land was stonier and climate less forgiving, corn assumed greater importance, its kernels saved from the previous harvest, dried and carefully stored through the winter. Corn, alongside beans and squash, was more than a crop, it was a lifeline, first cultivated by indigenous peoples and adopted by settlers who quickly realized its resilience. The rhythm of planting these seeds was both practical and symbolic, binding the farmer to practices older than the colonies themselves. Planting was often a family endeavor. Men guided plows, women followed to drop seed, children carried baskets of kernels or helped cover furrows with soil. The process unfolded in silence or in the murmur of simple instructions, repeated endlessly until the field lay marked with careful rows. It was not a labor of sudden exertion, but of steady repetition. Each seed dropped into the earth was a quiet wager against the uncertainties of weather, pests and disease. Each covering of soil was an act of trust in the unseen processes beneath the surface. Tools guided the rhythm. A plow cut furrows in straight lines, the farmer steering with patience as animals strained forward. Behind him, seed was dropped into the darkened grooves, measured not by precision of machinery but by the practiced hand. The hoe followed, drawing soil gently over kernels, patting the earth back into place. The pace was slow but continuous, and in that slowness lay its reliability. Fields could not be planted in haste. Each row had to be tended with attention, for mistakes now would ripple outward into hunger months later. The dependence on predictable cycles extended beyond the field. The colonial farmer often consulted an almanac, not because it revealed new truths, but because it confirmed what the senses already suspected. Almanacs noted phases of the moon, tides, and suggested days for sowing particular crops. Though not always precise, these guides reinforced the sense that planting was part of a greater pattern, a rhythm shared by all farmers across the colonies. To plant in spring was to participate in a collective act, each household turning its soil, each family laying seed, each settlement bound together by the same quiet urgency. Weather was both ally and adversary. Rains softened the ground, yet too much rain drowned seedlings before they took root. Sun warmed the soil, yet too much sun hardened it, making furrows brittle. The farmer moved within this balance, adjusting when he could, accepting when he could not. There were no irrigation systems beyond ditches dug by hand, no machines to shield against drought or flood. The planting season was therefore tinged with humility, a recognition that human effort could only guide, not control, the outcome. Spring planting was not confined to grains and corn. Gardens near the house received their share of attention. Here women often took the lead, planting herbs such as sage, thyme and parsley, vegetables like cabbage, carrots and onions. These gardens, smaller in scale, demanded equal patience, for they provided the daily sustenance that fields of grain could not. Each bed was weeded, each row marked, each seed placed with care. The rhythm of planting extended into these spaces, weaving together the practical and the domestic, the field and the household. As the days stretched longer, planting became a constant motion, repeated until the last seed was sown. The farmer rose at dawn, worked until the sun stood high, and returned in the evening with the memory of furrows stretching behind him. The work was exhausting in its persistence but never dramatic. No single act defined the planting season. It was the accumulation of days, each one nearly indistinguishable from the last, that brought the fields into being. There was also a spiritual undercurrent. Many farmers viewed the act of planting as aligned with divine order, a participation in creation itself. The seed buried in soil was not only a promise of harvest but a symbol of resurrection, a cycle mirrored in faith as well as in nature. Prayers were sometimes offered over fields, blessings spoken aloud or carried silently in the farmer's heart. The connection between soil, labor and sustenance was not abstract, it was immediate and deeply felt. Once planting was complete, the rhythm did not end but shifted. Fields had to be watched, weeds pulled, pests deterred, fences mended. Yet the act of sowing marked the transition from preparation to waiting. The farmer had done what he could, set in motion what might or might not bear fruit. The rhythm of planting gave way to the rhythm of growth, slower, more passive, yet equally binding. The dependence on cycles was absolute. The farmer knew that if spring faltered, if frost lingered too long, or rain failed to fall, the entire year would lean toward scarcity. The predictability of the seasons was both comforting and precarious, a reminder that life in the colonies was balanced on the edge of forces beyond control. Still, the planting was carried out with quiet steadiness, for to do otherwise was unthinkable. The earth awaited seed, and the farmer obliged, year after year, season after season. Thus, spring spread across the colonial countryside, not with bursts of sudden change, but with the slow, deliberate work of hands pressing seed into soil. The rhythm of planting was the rhythm of life itself, measured not in hours but in rows, not in days but in the emergence of green shoots weeks later. It was a rhythm as old as agriculture, carried into a new world, sustained by patience, and bound to the unyielding cycle of the land. When the farmhouse had begun to stir, and the hearth smoke lifted faintly into the morning air, attention soon turned outward, toward the yard where animals waited. The colonial farmyard was never silent, though its sounds were muted compared to the bustle of towns or the clamor of later mechanized farms. It was a low chorus, layered with the calls of cattle, the clucking of chickens, the occasional grunt of pigs, and the faint shuffle of hooves on packed earth. These noises were not disturbances but part of the texture of daily life, a steady background to the farmer's existence, reminding him that survival depended not only on the soil but on the creatures that shared his land. The yard itself was a space both practical and irregular. Fences of split rails or stone walls defined pens and pastures, though gaps often appeared, requiring constant repair. Mud gathered in hollows, hay and straw was strewn where animals bedded down, and troughs stood ready to hold water or feed. Beyond the immediate pens lay larger pastures, stretches of grass where cattle might graze under watchful eyes, yet always with the risk of wandering too far into woodland. The farmyard was not designed for orderliness or beauty. It was shaped by necessity, arranged so that animals could be tended with efficiency in the slow routines of each day. Cattle were among the most valuable of these animals. A cow's milk provided butter and cheese, staples of the colonial diet, and oxen, yoked in pairs, gave the strength needed to pull plows or wagons. Each morning, cows had to be milked, their udders heavy from the night's yield. The process was steady, familiar. The farmer or his wife seated on a low stool, hands working rhythmically, the sound of milk striking the pail. This labor was repeated without ceremony, day after day, yet its importance was constant, for without milk and its products, diets would narrow and weaken. The animals, in turn, required feeding, grooming, and shelter. Their presence demanded care as much as they provided sustenance. Pigs, less dignified but no less essential, rooted noisily in their pens. They were valued not for their daily contributions, but for the abundance they eventually yielded. Salted pork, lard, and cured meat sustained families through winters when fields lay barren. The morning routine with pigs was often less refined, tossing scraps into troughs, ensuring their pens were secure, watching their restless movements. Their grunts and squeals carried across the yard, a rougher music than the soft lowing of cattle, but one equally tied to the promise of nourishment. Colonial families often measured their security in part by the number and health of their pigs, for they represented a stored harvest of flesh, preserved against scarcity. Chickens formed the smallest but most constant presence. Their clucking filled the yard at all hours, a subdued chatter broken by the occasional crow of a rooster. Eggs were gathered daily, sometimes by children sent out with baskets, hands probing beneath straw for the fragile shells. The hens themselves required little beyond feed scattered by hand and protection from predators. Yet their output was steady, their eggs consumed fresh or preserved in lime water for leaner times. Feathers too were collected, stuffed into mattresses or pillows, adding comfort to otherwise coarse bedding. In their abundance and accessibility, chickens offered a daily reminder that small efforts could yield regular reward. Other animals often completed the scene. Sheep grazed in meadows, their wool shorn in spring for spinning. Goats, hardy and adaptable, supplied milk where cows were scarce. Horses, when afforded, provided not only strength for pulling but speed for travel. Each creature had its place, its role in the slow machinery of survival. None were kept for sentiment but for necessity, and yet over time familiarity bred a quiet bond. Farmers came to recognize the temperaments of their animals, their patterns of behavior, their signs of illness or distress. In the muted rhythm of feeding and tending, a form of companionship emerged, understated but undeniable. The barnyard was also a site of constant vigilance. Predators prowled the margins. Foxes seeking chickens, wolves or stray dogs threatening livestock, hawks circling overhead. Fences were mended not only to prevent wandering, but to ward off intrusion. Each morning's inspection included not just feeding, but ensuring the integrity of enclosures, patching where rails had shifted or stones had fallen. A neglected gap could mean the loss of an animal, and with it, a blow to the family's survival. Watering the animals was another task woven into the routine. Wells were drawn from with heavy buckets, or troughs filled from nearby streams. In winter, ice had to be broken, hands numbed by cold water, the effort doubled by the season's harshness. In summer, troughs dried quickly, requiring frequent refilling under the glare of the sun. These acts, mundane and repeated, formed part of the broader cycle of care, as essential as ploughing or planting. The barn itself, when present, was both shelter and storage. Within its dim interior, animals rested at night, hay was piled in lofts, tools leaned against beams. The air was thick with the mingled scents of straw, leather, and livestock. Sunlight entered in slants through cracks in the boards, illuminating dust that hung motionless before settling back to the floor. It was not a place of comfort, but of function, its presence central to the farmyard's order. The muted noise of the barnyard, the lowing, the clucking, the occasional sharp squeal, formed a soundscape as steady as the ticking of a clock. For the colonial farmer, this was the measure of daily life. Silence in the yard would have been unnatural, a sign of absence or loss. The sounds were reminders of continuity, of life sustained through care, of cycles that paralleled the planting of seed and the tending of crops. Each creature added its voice to the rhythm of the farm, a chorus that marked the beginning of day as clearly as the sun rising above the fields. Thus, as the farmer moved among his animals, scattering feed, drawing water, checking fences, he moved within a pattern repeated countless times before him, and destined to repeat countless times after. The care of cattle, pigs, and chickens was not dramatic but enduring, each gesture small yet vital. Together, they formed the quiet underpinning of colonial life, the unseen labor that ensured survival, the muted song of the barnyard blending seamlessly into the broader silence of the land. If the farm's animals were its living heartbeat, then water was its silent lifeblood, invisible until drawn, but always shaping every task and every habit. In the colonial countryside, water did not appear at the turn of a handle or the lift of a tap. It had to be fetched, carried, stored, and guarded with care. A well, a spring, or a nearby creek was often the most important feature of a homestead, as decisive as fertile soil or standing timber. Without a dependable source of fresh water, no farm could sustain its people, its animals, or its fields. The colonial well was at once commonplace and vital. Dug by hand, it descended through layers of soil and rock, lined with stone to prevent collapse, capped with a wooden cover to keep out leaves, animals, and debris. A simple frame of timbers supported a windlass or a sweep, a long wooden lever with a counterweight, from which a rope and bucket descended into darkness. Lowering the bucket was a task carried out slowly, with the creak of rope against wood and the hollow splash when it struck the water below. Drawing it up again required steady effort, hand over hand or crank by crank, until the bucket broke the surface, dripping and heavy, carrying the cold clarity of the earth upward into the light. The water drawn was rarely wasted. Each trip to the well was deliberate, for the bucket had weight enough when full, and the journey between well and house was often repeated many times in a day. Women and children most frequently bore this responsibility, balancing wooden pails with yokes across their shoulders, careful to spill as little as possible. The liquid they carried would be consumed at meals, boiled for cooking, poured into basins for washing, or tipped into troughs for the waiting animals. In each case, it was portioned with thought, for replenishing required more steps, more effort, more sweat drawn from bodies already weary with labor. Streams and creeks were also vital, though less reliable, subject to drought in summer and ice in winter. They provided not only water, but a place for laundering clothes, rinsing tools, or letting animals drink directly. Yet they came with hazards: the risk of contamination from upstream, the dangers of slipping banks or sudden currents, the need to carry loads farther back to the farmyard. Families with access to a steady spring often felt themselves fortunate, for it gave a flow less fickle than rain, and less burdensome than the endless raising of buckets. Within the home, water was stored in barrels or ceramic jugs, kept near the hearth where it would not freeze in winter's cold. Wooden tubs were filled for bathing, though baths were rare and reserved for necessity rather than comfort. Washing hands, rinsing vegetables, dousing fires, all called for water at the ready, and so one person in the household was often charged with ensuring vessels were never left empty. The presence of a brimming jug or barrel was a quiet assurance, a buffer against thirst or mishap. Its absence was immediately felt, a silence more pressing than the quiet of the fields. For the farmer, water's use extended beyond the household and into the soil itself. Rainfall was the most decisive form, beyond his control yet shaping his fortunes entirely. Too little rain meant withered stalks. Too much brought rot and flooding. Wells could offer drink, but rarely enough to irrigate fields on any scale. Their reserves were precious and reserved for survival. Thus the farmer watched the skies with the same patience with which he watched the growth of plants, reading clouds and winds as omens, turning almanac pages for hints of what the season might bring. His relationship with water was one of constant dependence, yet never of command. In the hotter months, carrying water became a near unending task. Animals drank deeply, the soil dried quickly, and the people themselves required relief. Wells grew shallower as summer advanced, and some families were forced to rise earlier or walk farther to springs not yet exhausted. Drought was a creeping enemy, not dramatic in its arrival, but merciless in its persistence. The parched earth cracked, the creeks dwindled, and the buckets returned heavier with disappointment than with substance. Colonial farmers knew these cycles and accepted them as part of the precarious balance that governed survival. Winter brought its own demands. Ice formed on troughs, sometimes so thick that it had to be broken with iron tools before animals could drink. Buckets froze to their rims, ropes stiffened in the cold, and carrying water became a trial of endurance. Snow could be melted, but the fuel required to keep fires burning day and night was a cost few could afford to pay. Thus the work of water continued, as relentless in January as in July, unbroken by season, unrelenting in necessity. Water also bore symbolic weight, shaping customs and habits beyond the purely practical. Wells were places where neighbors met, exchanging words while drawing buckets. Gossip carried on the same air as the scent of damp earth. Springs were landmarks, their constancy remembered and passed through generations. Rivers became boundaries, both physical and social, defining what belonged to one community and what to another. In each of these, water was not merely a utility, but a presence, one that quietly bound together the lives scattered across the countryside. The colonial farmer moved through these patterns without haste, each day repeating the same gestures, each gesture tracing a line back to necessity. To draw water, to carry it, to pour it carefully into waiting vessels. These were not dramatic acts, but without them no household could endure. The flow of water from well or spring into jug and trough was as essential a rhythm as the planting of seed or the tending of animals. It was a flow unending, patient, silent, the steady pulse beneath the visible labors of the land. Beside nearly every colonial farmhouse lay a modest but indispensable space, the kitchen garden. Unlike the broad fields planted with corn, wheat, or tobacco, this garden was smaller, enclosed, and close at hand, a place where daily steps carried one from doorway to soil within moments. It was not cultivated for profit or for trade, but for survival and for flavor, offering variety where otherwise meals might fall into sameness. Here, in carefully tended rows, vegetables and herbs took root, tended not with heavy plows and yokes of oxen, but with hand tools and patient effort, their presence a quiet companion to the routines of the farmhouse. The garden's design was simple yet deliberate. A patch of ground, cleared of stones and stumps, fenced to keep out chickens and wandering pigs, arranged in beds that could be weeded and watered without excess strain. Some were rectangular, laid in orderly lines, others bent around the shape of the house, or followed the contour of a slope. Soil near the dwelling was often more fertile, enriched by kitchen scraps, ashes from the hearth, and manure carried by hand from the barnyard. The garden was never left to chance. Each season, seeds were set aside, saved from last year's yield or traded with neighbors, their planting guided by the turning pages of almanacs or the recollection of generations. Vegetables filled these beds in humble abundance. Beans wound their way upward on poles, their vines tangled and their pods heavy by late summer. Squash spread broad leaves across the ground, their yellow blossoms promising the fruits to come. Cabbages clustered in tight heads, carrots pushed orange roots deep into the earth, and onions raised green shoots above their hidden bulbs. Each variety answered to its own time, some sprouting quickly in spring, others maturing late and stored through winter. The garden, small though it was, provided a continuity of harvest, a steady trickle of food supplementing the larger surges of the fields. Herbs grew alongside the vegetables, their uses extending beyond taste into remedy and preservation. Parsley, sage and thyme flavored stews that simmered long on the hearth. Dill was gathered to pickle cucumbers. Mint was brewed into teas thought to ease the stomach. Medicinal plants, yarrow for fevers, comfrey for wounds, horehound for coughs, were cultivated not as luxuries but as necessities, for a physician was seldom near, and cures were often drawn directly from the soil. The garden thus served both body and spirit, its greenery offering relief from the monotony of grain and meat, its leaves and roots pressed into service when illness or injury arose. Tending the garden was daily work, light in comparison to the ploughing of fields but constant nonetheless. Weeding was essential, for unchecked growth of thistle or crabgrass could choke tender shoots. Watering was done by hand, dipping from buckets and sprinkling over rows when rains failed. Insects were picked off by careful fingers, and when frost threatened, makeshift coverings of cloth or straw might be laid to shield fragile sprouts. Children were often tasked with these chores, their small hands nimble enough to work among seedlings, their youthful energy harnessed for errands that kept the soil in order. The produce gathered from the garden entered the kitchen almost immediately, shaping meals that were plain but sustaining. Cornbread might be served with beans, stews bulked with carrots and onions, greens boiled until soft beside salted meat. Nothing was wasted. Leaves were dried for winter, roots stored in cellars, herbs hung in bunches from rafters to cure. Pickling and fermenting extended the life of cucumbers and cabbage, vinegar jars lined up alongside sacks of flour. In a world where scarcity hovered always near, the garden's yield was not abundance but assurance, a quiet buffer against the lean months. Beyond sustenance, the kitchen garden represented a closeness between household and land. Every step into its narrow paths was a reminder of dependence. Every handful of soil turned with a hoe, a gesture of partnership. The larger fields may have produced the wealth of crops for trade or storage, but it was the garden that furnished daily life with freshness and variation. Its nearness to the house spoke to its importance. One need not walk far to find a handful of herbs, a basket of beans or a head of lettuce. The garden's proximity placed it at the center of nourishment, as much a part of the household as the hearth itself. There was also a subtle order to its cultivation, an inherited knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next. Which plants thrived beside one another, which should be kept apart, how deep to sow each seed, how to recognize when roots were ready to pull. These were matters not recorded formally, but known through practice. Almanacs offered guidance in broad strokes, noting phases of the moon and favored days for planting, but the true rhythm was learned by hand and eye, each farmer's family adapting to the soil and seasons of their own place. Through the year the garden changed its face. In spring bare earth sprouted with tender shoots, a promise of what was to come. By summer it was lush, leaves overlapping, blossoms bright against the green, bees humming among the flowers. Autumn brought the harvest, the pulling of roots, the gathering of gourds, the tying of herbs in drying bundles. Winter stripped it bare once more, snow covering beds that held only the memory of growth, while seeds lay stored in sacks or jars, awaiting the cycle to begin again. The garden beside the house was small, yet it represented an essential balance between human labor and natural provision. It was not a place of luxury, nor was it ornamental. Instead it was practical, intimate, and enduring. Its presence a testament to the steady work of hands shaping survival out of soil. In its quiet rows of beans and herbs, one could read the story of colonial life itself, a story not of grand events or sweeping changes, but of patient tending, small yields, and the slow, dependable rhythm of food drawn from the earth each season. In the life of a colonial farmer, the year was not divided by weeks or by hours, for clocks were few, and their presence often confined to churches or town halls. Instead, the calendar was written upon the land itself, and time revealed itself in the turning of leaves, the behavior of animals, the changing warmth of air, and the steady course of the sun across the horizon. Seasons dictated the rhythm of every task, and though the farmer might glance at an almanac for guidance, it was the world around him that spoke with the clearest authority. Spring, with its damp soils and lengthening days, signaled beginnings. The farmer rose earlier, as light stretched further into morning, and the ground, softened by rain, became ready for seed. The tasks of spring were careful and hopeful, ploughing, planting, mending fences loosened by frost, and tending to young livestock born in the cold months. Work was constant but tempered by anticipation, for the land seemed alive with promise, and each sprout that broke the surface gave reassurance that labor had not been in vain. As spring deepened into summer, the work shifted gradually, though no sudden change marked the transition. The air warmed until mornings were no longer sharp with frost, but heavy with dew. Birds that had returned from migration filled the woods with steady song, and the fields, once bare, now grew dense with green. With this shift came new labors, weeding to protect fragile crops, repairing tools, dulled by planting, cutting hay for storage before it grew too coarse, and watching closely for signs of drought or pests. Summer was a season of vigilance, less about beginning, and more about guarding what had been set into motion. Tasks in summer were governed by endurance. The heat slowed the body, but it did not slow the need for work. Farmers and their families rose early to use the cool hours before noon, resting briefly at midday when the sun pressed most heavily, then returning to chores in the late afternoon, when shadows lengthened once more. Water had to be drawn more frequently for animals, fields had to be walked for signs of blight, and the steady hum of insects reminded all that crops shared their growth with countless unseen competitors. The household, too, altered its routines with the season. Hearth fires, kept large and constant in winter, were allowed to burn lower in summer, for heat was now an enemy, rather than a comfort. Meals were simpler, often relying on fresh vegetables from the garden, which offered a welcome change from the salted meats and dried provisions of winter. Children, freed from the heaviest of planting tasks, spent long hours tending to smaller duties, collecting berries from the edges of fields, chasing away birds that threatened to peck at ripening corn, or helping gather herbs while the sun dried them to preservation. The seasonal passage was also felt in the animals. Cows moved to pastures where grass was thick, needing less supplemental feeding from the farmer's stores. Chickens scratched more freely in the warm dust of the yard, their eggs plentiful. Pigs grew heavier as scraps and foraged greens were added to their troughs. With warmth came abundance, but also the risk of overconfidence. Disease spread more easily in heat. Water sources grew stagnant, fences softened by rain sagged under pressure. Thus, the farmer remained attentive, walking boundaries, watching skies, measuring not with instruments but with experience. Time in these months was tracked less by numbers than by signs. The blossoming of apple trees marked a point as clear as any date upon a page, while the arrival of fireflies in the evening fields told of summer's height. The farmer measured days not by hours but by tasks. The day it was right to cut hay, the day beans reached their first picking, the day calves were old enough to be led to pasture. These markers bound his year into a cycle that repeated predictably, yet always carried subtle differences, each summer slightly unlike the last in rain, in sun, in yield. Religious and community observances, too, punctuated the turning of seasons. A Sunday gathering in June might be spoken of for years, remembered for its weather or the sermon given, while a midsummer wedding or christening tied personal memory to the broader rhythm of the earth. Yet beneath these events the farmer's private calendar remained constant. Tend the crops, feed the animals, preserve what can be preserved, prepare for what will inevitably come after. By late summer, the land began to hint at the next transition. Fields that had once been fresh with green now bore signs of maturity, wheat heads heavy and bowed, corn stalks tall and tasseled, beans thick on their vines. The air carried a different weight, the cool of morning returning, not sharp but suggestive. The work shifted once again, away from guarding and toward preparing. Tools were sharpened, scythes inspected, wagons readied for the harvest to come. The farmer, accustomed to patience, knew that summer's abundance was not an end in itself, but a passage toward the gathering that autumn demanded. In this way, The movement from spring to summer was less a change than a deepening, a broadening of the year's pattern. Life on the colonial farm did not follow abrupt turns but rather flowed like a river, each bend gradual, each shift continuous. What began as planting became weeding, what began as tending became guarding, and what began as green promise became the swelling weight of ripening grain. To live by this rhythm was to accept that time itself was circular, not linear. The same tasks repeating with slight variations, the same seasons arriving with subtle difference, the same work demanded year after year. The colonial farmer measured time not in minutes but in cycles. The passing from spring into summer was not a number on a calendar, but a feeling in the soil, a sound in the yard, a weight in the air. It was in the length of shadows at dusk, in the warmth of water drawn from the well, in the smell of fields heavy with clover. Such was the way of life in a world where nature's voice spoke louder than clocks, and where survival meant listening carefully to its steady, unhurried song. As summer ripened and the fields grew dense with grain, the farmer's attention began to shift toward the coming harvest. It was not a single day, nor even a week, but a season in itself, a time when months of labor, patience and hope stood on the brink of becoming sustenance. The stalks of wheat bent under their own weight, their golden heads whispering in the breeze. Corn stood tall, tassels turning, cobs swelling within their husks. Beans and squash filled their vines and patches, promising yield if the weather held steady. The land carried a look of fullness, and with it came the unspoken tension of readiness. Everything was almost, but not quite, ready to be taken in. Harvest could not be rushed, yet it could not be delayed either. To cut too soon was to risk grain not fully matured. To wait too long was to invite rot, storms, or theft by birds and animals. Thus, the farmer watched with patient calculation, walking the fields, breaking open kernels between his fingers, feeling their hardness, and listening to the sound they made when bitten. The decision of when to begin was one of the most important of the year, and though experience guided it, uncertainty always lingered. Before the first stalk was cut, preparations filled the days. Tools, long idle since planting, were brought from their places in barn and shed. Scythes, their blades curved and narrow, were lifted to the light, edges inspected for rust or dullness. Whetstones were drawn across the steel in slow, practiced strokes, each pass whispering as it honed the blade to sharpness. Sickles, smaller but no less important, were sharpened as well, their short handles fitted for close work among dense stalks. Wooden rakes, with teeth worn smooth from years of use, were repaired if needed, new tines carved from scraps of wood. The act of sharpening and mending was itself a ritual of anticipation, each tool prepared like a soldier before battle, each adjustment a gesture of readiness. Wagons and carts were inspected too. Their wheels, bound in iron, needed oiling, their axles had to be checked for cracks. Rope was coiled and set aside for binding sheaves, while leather harnesses for oxen were mended and softened with tallow to prevent splitting under strain. Even baskets, woven from reeds or splints, were examined, for a weak basket could spill its load and waste what had been so hard to grow. These small tasks filled the lengthening days of late summer, their quiet repetition underscoring the seriousness of the work to come. In the household, preparations were made for the added labor harvest required. Extra food was set aside, bread baked in larger loaves, dried meat brought from storage to feed weary hands. Children were reminded of their duties, for harvest was not the work of one, but of many, and even the youngest carried bundles, gathered beans, or drove birds from the fields. Neighbors too might be called upon, for reaping large fields demanded more hands than a single family could spare. In return, the farmer would offer his own labor when their turn came, a rhythm of exchange that bound communities together as firmly as fences or roads. As tools were readied and provisions secured, the farmer's gaze returned again and again to the skies. The threat of storms haunted the late summer months, when heavy rains could flatten wheat or rot corn still standing in the field. A sudden hail could strip away a season's labor in a single afternoon. Thus, the watching of weather became an anxious pastime. Almanacs were consulted, though their predictions were vague, promising fair skies or rain with equal possibility. More often, the farmer read the clouds, felt the direction of the wind, and noted the behavior of birds. Nature offered its signs, if one had patience enough to interpret them. There was also an unspoken weight in these days, a tension that mingled with the practical tasks. The harvest was not simply the gathering of food, it was the moment when the year's labor stood to be proven or undone. A poor yield meant hunger through winter. A surplus meant security, perhaps even the chance to trade for goods otherwise unreachable. The anticipation of reaping carried both hope and unease, for it was the culmination of everything the farmer had done since spring. Months of ploughing, planting, weeding, watering, and guarding were now balanced on the edge of success or disappointment. Evenings in this time carried a different air. After tools were sharpened and animals fed, the farmer might sit outside the wooden house, looking out over fields that glowed in the last light of the sun. The stalks swayed together, moving as one vast sea, their rustling steady, unbroken and full. To sit in this sound was to sit in expectation, to know that soon the sickle would cut, the scythe would swing, and the grain would be gathered. It was a pause, fragile and fleeting, before the work that would test every limb and every back in the household. The harvest did not arrive suddenly, yet its approach was felt in every gesture. The sharpening of steel, the mending of wood, the baking of bread, the storing of water, all were preparations for days that would begin before dawn and end long after dusk. Each action carried an unspoken knowledge. Soon the waiting would end, and the long, patient tending would give way to the intense labor of gathering. The anticipation was not loud or anxious but steady, a weight borne with the same endurance that had carried the farmer through every other season. And so on the edge of autumn, with fields heavy and tools ready, the colonial farm stood poised between waiting and doing. The days of harvest had not yet begun, but the land, the household, and the farmer himself were prepared. The silence before reaping was almost as significant as the act itself, a moment suspended in time when the year's labor was gathered, not in barns or wagons but in expectation. Soon the scythes would bite into stalks, the sheaves would be tied, and the wagons would groan beneath their loads. But for now, the farm breathed quietly, sharpening, mending and waiting for the harvest to begin. The moment arrived quietly, without fanfare, in the still air of late summer. The wheat had ripened, its stalks turned from green to the muted tones of gold and straw, their heads heavy and bowed, as if weary from carrying the weight of the season. When touched, the kernels were firm, no longer soft, and when bitten, they broke cleanly with a dry snap. The signs were clear, understood not through books or records, but through the long practice of watching the land. The harvest would begin. At dawn, before the heat thickened in the air, the farmer walked into the field with his scythe. The blade, sharpened to a gleam in the days before, caught the faint light of morning. The first cut was never rushed. It was deliberate, a clean swing through the stalks that sent them falling in unison, their rustle like a hushed breath across the field. One motion became another, and another, the scythe gliding, the stalks collapsing in arcs, the ground behind him slowly cleared. It was the beginning of an immense task, and it carried with it both relief and weight. The harvest of wheat was not just the gathering of grain, but the securing of survival. Each stalk mattered, each sheaf tied and stored, meant bread in winter, seed for spring or trade for goods, otherwise unreachable. Nothing could be wasted. The farmer's movements were steady, measured, and repetitive, conserving strength for the long hours ahead. His hands, calloused from months of labor, gripped the worn handle without thought, each swing of the scythe the product of years of habit. Sweat gathered, even in the cool of morning, but still the rhythm held, slow and continuous. Behind him, family members followed, gathering the fallen stalks into bundles. These were bound into sheaves with twine, or twisted stalks themselves, tied firmly so they could stand upright in the field. Sheaves were leaned against one another in small stooks, their pointed tops shedding rain and allowing the grain to dry before threshing. The sight of stooks scattered across the field was one of order and reassurance, each small cluster representing a measure of food secured. To walk through a field dotted with stooks was to walk through the visible promise of bread, porridge and survival. The sound of the harvest was muted, but constant. The swish of the scythe, the rustle of falling stalks, the creak of leather harnesses when oxen moved carts, the murmur of family voices carrying across the field. Birds called from hedges, sometimes darting in to snatch a stray kernel, but the farmers' children drove them away with shouts or clapping sticks. The air itself seemed thick with grain dust, carrying the faint sweetness of ripened wheat, a smell both earthy and dry. It clung to skin and hair, mixing with the sweat of labor. Hours passed without the sense of hours. The work was not measured by time but by progress across the field, the line of cut stalks stretching further, the stalks multiplying behind. Breaks were rare, brief pauses taken to drink from a wooden bucket of water or chew a piece of bread brought from the house. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows at first, then shortening them until they lay beneath the workers' feet. The day wore on, yet the field, large and unrelenting, still held much to be gathered. The labor was shared, and in sharing, it became bearable. Older children carried sheaves, their arms straining under the weight, but their faces set with determination. Younger ones gathered stray stalks or drove the oxen that pulled wagons slowly across the edge of the field. Women moved steadily, binding sheaves with practiced hands, their skirts brushing through the stubble. Each roll, though small when viewed alone, formed part of the larger whole, without which the harvest could not be carried forward. There was no room for haste. To rush was to leave stalks behind, to dull the blade, to tire too quickly. The harvest demanded endurance, the slow gathering of abundance that could not be hurried. In the long rhythm of cutting, binding and stacking, time seemed to lose its edges. The farmer thought not of hours or days, but only of the task, the field, the scythe, the sheaves rising steadily behind him. The wheat itself was more than food. It was currency, stability, and a marker of independence. In colonial America, wheat could be ground into flour for bread, traded at mills or markets, or stored as seed for the following spring. A poor wheat harvest could force dependence on others, while a strong one gave a family security, and perhaps even the ability to acquire iron tools, cloth or salt from town. Each sheaf tied was a thread in the fabric of survival, and this gave to the harvest a solemnity beyond the simple act of reaping grain. By late afternoon, fatigue set in, though the work continued. The sky's arc slowed, shoulders ached, backs bent with effort, yet still the line of stalks spread across the field. The light softened, turning the wheat to amber, the air cooling as the sun dipped. At last, the farmer paused, leaning on the handle of the scythe, and looked out over what had been done. Stalks stood like small sentinels across the field, ordered and waiting, while uncut wheat still bent in the breeze ahead. It was not finished, but it was begun, and that was enough for the day. Evening brought the slow walk back to the farmhouse. Tools carried, bodies weary, dust clung to clothes, and the smell of wheat lingered. Inside, the house filled with the subdued clatter of supper. Bread, perhaps beans, perhaps salted pork, a meal to restore strength for the days yet to come. The talk was quiet, often about the progress of the harvest, the state of the weather, the tasks for tomorrow. When the candles burned low, sleep came easily, heavy with fatigue, yet the rustle of wheat and the swing of the scythe seemed to echo still in the mind. And so the harvest of wheat continued, day after day, until the field was cleared, the sheaves gathered, and the promise of bread and survival secured. It was not an event but a process, slow and demanding, requiring steady labor from all. The wheat in the field was more than a crop. It was the heart of the farm, the foundation of life through the winter, the measure of the year's success. Each sheaf, carefully tied and gathered, was not merely stalks of grain, but the quiet assurance of continuity in a world that offered little certainty. In the colonial fields, alongside the golden expanse of wheat, another pattern of growth unfolded, one older and deeply rooted in the soil of the continent. Corn, beans and squash, the crops sometimes called the Three Sisters, grew not only as individual plants, but in companionship with one another, a cycle of interdependence that ensured sustenance for countless families. All wheat spoke of Europe, of bread and markets. This trio spoke of the land itself, of native traditions adapted by colonists, of survival crafted through harmony with the earth. Corn rose first, tall and sturdy, its stalks thrusting upward through spring's warmth, into summer's fullness. The leaves unfurled broad and sharp, rustling in every breeze. In time, tassels emerged at the top, scattering pollen onto the pale silks that pushed from each ear. A quiet exchange carried on the wind. Beneath its shade and protection, beans coiled upward, sending tendrils spiraling around the stalks. The slender stems and leaves climbed steadily, taking strength from corn's support, turning what was once a solitary plant into a living pillar of cooperation. At their base spread the low, sprawling vines of squash, their broad leaves shading the soil, locking in moisture, and holding back weeds. Together they formed a miniature ecosystem, tall, climbing and sprawling, each fulfilling what the others lacked. The farmer observed this growth with the same quiet patience that marked all agricultural life. Corn, with its heavy yield of kernels, was the staple, roasted fresh in summer, dried and ground into meal for bread and porridge, boiled into hearty stews. Beans, rich in nourishment, stored well when dried, their variety of shapes and colors filling wooden bowls in winter. Squash, harvested when ripe, gave flesh that could be roasted, baked or stewed, while its seeds and blossoms found use as well. The three crops together formed a balanced diet in a time when such balance could mean the difference between health and weakness. The cycle of planting had long been shaped by Native American knowledge, and colonists, through necessity, adopted many of these practices. In spring, when the soil warmed, small mounds were raised by hand, each shaped with a hoe or the blunt end of a tool. Into these mounds went the kernels of corn, pressed into the soil and left to sprout. When the young corn stood several inches tall, beans were planted nearby, their seeds small and unassuming. Later still, squash seeds were added, each nestled into the soil around the base. The timing was precise. Too soon, and the vines would smother tender stalks; too late, and the balance would falter. Generations of observation lay behind such decisions, and colonists who followed them reaped the benefit of crops that sustained not only individuals, but entire communities. As summer ripened, the trio filled the fields with life. Corn whispered in the wind, its stalks swaying in long rows. Beans wound ever upward, their leaves softening the rigid lines of stalks, their pods swelling with the promise of food. Squash leaves spread wide, thick and coarse, their yellow blossoms opening to bees and insects that hummed among them. The ground beneath grew cooler, shaded, the soil kept damp against the drying heat of summer. It was a living illustration of interdependence, one plant giving height, another giving nitrogen to the soil, and another guarding the roots against the sun. Harvest came in stages, slow and steady. First the beans, gathered when the pods were full and still tender, later left to dry until they rattled within their shells. Then squash, heavy and varied, some round and dark, others long and pale, lifted carefully and stored in cool, dry places where they could last for months. Finally the corn, when its husks had dried and kernels hardened, was pulled from the stalks, husked and hung in braids or piled in baskets, its color ranging from pale yellow to deep gold, sometimes streaked with reds or blues, depending on the variety grown. Each crop, once harvested, became part of the winter's store. Cornmeal, pounded or ground, became bread, mush, or johnny cakes, simple foods filling and enduring. Beans, boiled slowly, gave warmth on cold nights, their protein sustaining bodies weary from labor. Squash, baked or stewed, offered sweetness and variety when other flavors were scarce. Together they formed a diet that echoed through seasons, their value measured not only in nourishment, but in reliability. For a colonial farmer, to have bins of corn, jars of beans, and a cellar filled with squash, was to hold security against the long months when snow lay deep and fields lay bare. Beyond their physical sustenance, the trio carried meaning. They tied the colonist to the land and its original stewards, for these crops were not foreign imports, but native companions, adapted over centuries before Europeans arrived. In planting them, farmers partook in a continuity of tradition older than their settlements, though often without acknowledgement. Yet the quiet reliance was there, unspoken, as cornmeal replaced wheat in times of scarcity, as beans filled pots when meat was rare, as squash gave its flesh when gardens lay dormant. Survival in America, for many, was shaped not by wheat alone, but by these enduring sisters. The farmer, in walking his field, understood their importance in a way that did not require words. He saw it in the sturdiness of corn stalks rising against the sky, in the twisting of bean vines that clung with tenacity, in the broad sweep of squash vines covering the earth. He knew it in the ease of storage, the versatility of cooking, the steady way these crops sustained not just himself but his household. The trio was a quiet form of wealth, measured not in coin, but in the steady comfort of full larders and strong bodies through the lean months. Evenings in late summer carried the sounds of husking, the rustle of dry leaves pulled back from cobs, the clatter of kernels stripped and stored. Children often joined in, laughing at the chance finds of red or multicolored ears, sometimes celebrated as tokens of good luck. Beans were shelled by hand, their seeds falling into wooden bowls with a soft, steady sound. Squash, heavy and firm, was set carefully in rows along cellar shelves, their skin tough and protective. These tasks stretched into the hours after sundown, lanterns flickering in the farmhouse, the quiet labor continuing long after the fields had gone dark. In this way the trio of corn, beans and squash sustained the colonial household, not as exotic crops but as daily companions. They were eaten without ceremony, incorporated into stews, breads or side dishes, their flavors simple but enduring. Yet in their simplicity lay strength, a strength passed down through centuries of cultivation. Together they provided a foundation of nourishment that no farm could ignore, a cycle of growth and harvest that linked families to the soil and to the unbroken rhythm of the seasons. After the long weeks of harvesting, when sheaves of wheat were gathered, corn was husked, and beans shelled and dried, the farmer's labor did not end at the edge of his fields. Grain, though harvested, was not yet food in its most usable form. Wheat, corn and rye still lay in kernels, hard and unyielding, requiring transformation before they could be eaten daily as bread, porridge or gruel. That transformation took place in the mill house, a place both practical and strangely solemn, where stone and water worked together to make grain into sustenance. The mill was often not the farmer's own, but a shared resource for the surrounding community. Some villages had a water-powered gristmill, its wheel turning slowly in a stream or river, its timbers creaking as the current drove its motion. Others relied on smaller hand mills or querns, kept within households for times when travel was difficult. Yet the large water-driven mill was a landmark in many colonial landscapes, its sound carrying faintly across fields and meadows, the steady churn of water against wood, the muted grind of stone against stone. To bring grain to the mill was itself a process. Wagons, loaded with sacks of wheat or corn, rattled along dirt paths toward the mill house. The sacks were heavy, filled with the season's effort, their cloth rough against the hands of those who lifted and carried them. Farmers often traveled together, sharing the task, speaking little as their animals drew them slowly along rutted roads. The arrival at the mill was not hurried, wagons lined up, each waiting its turn, for the stones could only grind so much in a day. Inside, the mill house carried a different atmosphere than the fields. Light filtered through narrow windows, dust motes suspended in the air, catching the beams. The scent was unmistakable. The dry, warm smell of grain mingled with the earthy dust of ground flour, a smell that clung to clothes and hair. The sound was steady and rhythmic, a constant grinding that was neither loud nor quiet but a middle tone, insistent and unending. It was not a place of chatter or noise. Voices were low, subdued by the labor of the machinery and the awareness of its importance. The miller, often a figure of both usefulness and authority, oversaw the process. He adjusted the stones, set the flow of grain, and ensured the grind was neither too coarse nor too fine. His skill mattered, for a poorly ground batch could waste grain or spoil bread. Payment for his services was often taken in kind, a portion of the flour, called the miller's toll, which he kept as compensation. This practice, though sometimes resented, was necessary, for the miller's craft and maintenance of the mill were as vital to the community as the farmer's ploughing or the blacksmith's ironwork. The act of grinding was deceptively simple in appearance. Grain was poured into a hopper, a funnel-shaped wooden container, from which it descended between two great stones. The lower stone, called the bedstone, lay still, while the upper stone, the runner, turned with the motion of the water wheel. Between them, kernels were cracked, crushed and powdered, emerging as flour or meal, depending on the grain and the settings of the stones. The ground product was collected below, sifted if finer texture was desired, and then bagged again for transport home. Watching the stones turn could be hypnotic. The slow, circular motion endless, the sound of grinding steady and unchanging. Farmers waiting their turn often sat quietly, leaning against walls or benches, their bodies weary from harvest, but their minds calmed by the monotony of the sound. It was a pause in the relentless activity of the season, a moment where the work was not in their hands but in the turning of stone and wheel. The flour or meal taken home carried more than sustenance. It carried possibility. Wheat flour became bread, dense or leavened, baked in ovens or on hearths. Cornmeal became johnny cakes, mush, or the base for stews, its coarse texture filling and enduring. Rye flour, darker and more bitter, still served well in times when wheat was scarce. Families measured their stores carefully, calculating how long each sack would last, how much could be spared for trade or hospitality, how much must be held in reserve for the lean months. Storage itself was a quiet science. Flour was kept in barrels or sacks, raised from damp floors to avoid rot. Cornmeal, more prone to spoilage, was used steadily, ground fresh when possible, rather than left long unused. The cellar or pantry, cool and dark, became a place of assurance, each container a marker of security. The sight of barrels lined in rows, sacks stacked neatly, gave comfort on cold nights, when fields lay frozen, for they represented the labor of summer preserved against the hunger of winter. The mill in this sense was more than a building. It was a point of transformation, where the raw bounty of the land became usable, where survival was measured in sacks of flour and meal rather than in fields of stalks. Its quiet, steady work stood apart from the noisy bustle of farming, its rhythm one of patience and inevitability. The sound of its stones turning was, in its way, as much a part of the seasonal cycle as the call of spring birds or the rustle of autumn leaves. For the farmer, leaving the mill with full sacks was a moment of muted satisfaction. The wagons creaked homeward, wheels cutting into soft earth, animals plodding patiently along. The flour carried inside the farmhouse would be set carefully in its place, another step completed in the long chain of labor that stretched from spring planting to winter feasting. It was one more assurance that the household would endure, one more rhythm fulfilled in the endless pattern of colonial farm life. And so, in the turning of stone against stone, in the steady murmur of water and wheel, in the quiet air thick with flour dust, the grain of the fields was made into the bread of life. The mill was never hurried, never dramatic, but always constant. Its silence was not of absence but of constancy, a silence filled with motion, with sound, with necessity. The farmer knew this, felt it in the weight of sacks lifted onto wagons, in the sight of flour dust clinging to sleeves. The mill was not only a place he visited, but a place he depended upon, as much a part of his survival as the soil, the seed and the seasons themselves. After the gathering of crops and the grinding of grain, the farmer's work did not ease into idleness. The abundance of autumn was only a promise, not a guarantee, for food that lay in fields or wagons remained vulnerable to decay, theft or waste. To survive the coming winter, when frost sealed the ground and snow lay heavy, every piece of food had to be preserved, stored and guarded with care. This was not a labor of excitement or novelty, but of repetition, a quiet, patient process that filled barns, cellars and pantries with the slow assurance of survival. Meat demanded particular attention. Freshly slaughtered pork or beef could not be left long in its raw state, for within days it would spoil. The solution lay in salt, coarse white crystals that drew moisture from flesh and kept rot at bay. In large wooden tubs or barrels, joints of pork were packed, layer upon layer, with salt poured thick between them. The salt burned into cracks and pores, stiffening the meat, making it less pleasant to touch but more enduring to keep. Sometimes brine was added, a mixture of salt and water that further seeped into the flesh. These barrels, once sealed, were heavy, their contents able to last for months. The flavor was harsh, the meat tough, but in January, when snow covered the fields, it was nourishment enough. Fish too was salted or smoked, If a farmer lived near rivers or the coast, barrels of salted cod or herring might be stored, each small body stiff and pale with crystals, stacked in rows like cordwood. Smoked meat carried another character. Strips of venison, pork or even fowl were hung in smokehouses, where slow fires smoldered for days. The smoke darkened the flesh, hardened it, and gave it a taste sharp and lingering. Entering a smokehouse was to be surrounded by the scent of preservation, not fresh or sweet, but heavy, acrid and enduring, a smell that clung to hair and clothes. Roots and vegetables required different care. Potatoes, carrots, turnips and onions were gathered and carried into root cellars. These spaces, dug into the ground and lined with stone or timber, were cool and damp, insulated by earth from the extremes of frost and sun. Within, vegetables were piled in bins or laid out on shelves, their skin unwashed to preserve the thin protective layer of soil. The air was heavy, earthy, tinged with the sharpness of onion, or the sweetness of apples stored in barrels nearby. Root cellars were dark, lit only by the faint flame of a lantern when someone descended the steps, and their silence was broken only by the drip of moisture or the scurry of a mouse. Grain, already milled or still in kernel form, was stored in sacks or barrels. Each container was sealed against pests, for mice and insects were constant threats. Some farmers hung sacks from rafters, others set them on raised platforms to keep them from damp floors. Corn, in particular, was often kept on the cob, dried and hung in braids or heaped in bins, its husks rustling faintly when disturbed. The monotony of storing grain was as important as any dramatic act of harvest, for a poorly sealed sack or damp barrel could mean the loss of weeks of food. Preservation extended to fruit as well. Apples were a staple, kept in barrels or stored carefully on racks so that air could circulate around them. Some were dried in slices, strung on cords near hearths until they shriveled into leathery rings, ready to be rehydrated in winter stews. Cider too was made, pressed from apples until the juice ran, stored in barrels that foamed and fermented into drink. Cider was safer than water in many cases, lasting through months when fresh sources froze or grew stagnant. Barrels became a recurring image in this season of preparation. Barrels of meat, barrels of flour, barrels of cider, barrels of beans. Each was sealed, marked and stored in barns, cellars or sheds. Their round shapes filled corners and lined walls, their weight a silent reassurance. To walk through a storage space filled with barrels was to walk through the winter itself in anticipation, to see meals, weeks and months already waiting, though locked in wood and iron hoops. The work of preservation was repetitive, its rhythm measured not in moments of satisfaction but in the dull weight of labor completed. Salt had to be rubbed into each joint of meat, layer after layer, until hands grew raw. Vegetables had to be lifted, carried and placed in bins, each one handled individually, though countless lay in piles. Apples had to be turned so they would not rot, their skins inspected one by one. Grain had to be lifted, hauled and sealed, the weight of each sack pressing against shoulders and backs. It was not the labor of urgency, like harvest, but the labor of patience, the kind that stretched across days with little variation. Children were often set to tasks of storage, carrying onions into cellars, stringing beans to dry, husking corn before it was hung. Women oversaw the arrangement of supplies, their judgment keen in knowing what would last longest, what must be used first, and how to guard against waste. Men bore the heaviest barrels, tended the smokehouses, and lifted carcasses into place. The household as a whole worked in unison, bound by the unspoken knowledge that the months ahead would test what they stored now. Evening after evening, as autumn deepened, the farmhouse filled with the subdued bustle of preservation. The smell of boiling brine drifted from kitchens, the sound of knife against wood echoed as vegetables were cut, the flicker of firelight caught on hanging strips of meat. There was no celebration in this work, only steadiness. Each action, whether rubbing salt, stacking barrels, or lowering baskets into cellars, was a thread in the fabric of endurance. When the tasks were done, when the last barrel was sealed and the cellar filled, the sense of completion was not triumphant but quiet. The household could look upon its stores with the calm assurance that hunger would not easily breach its walls. Yet, even this assurance carried with it vigilance. Barrels would need checking, apples turning, cellars inspected for damp or vermin. Preservation was not a single act but a long, dull guardianship, extending deep into winter nights. Thus the farmer's life moved from the brightness of harvest to the dimness of storage, from the open expanse of fields to the enclosed stillness of cellars and smokehouses. It was not the labor of visible abundance, but of hidden endurance. Food, once living and growing, now lay silent, sealed or hanging, awaiting the months when it would be summoned from storage into stewpots and hearths. And so the year pressed onward, the fullness of autumn carefully packed away, transformed into quiet security against the emptiness of winter. As the heavy labors of harvest and preservation reached their completion, the landscape itself began to quiet. The fevered pace of summer had passed, and the farmer now stood within a season of transition, where the earth bore the marks of work accomplished but no longer demanded his constant exertion. Autumn settled over the countryside, not with a single moment of change, but with a slow, steady fading, a lengthening of shadows, and a softening of sounds. The land, once crowded with crops and busy hands, gradually became a place of rest, though beneath that rest lay the stern reminder of cold days drawing near. The fields, stripped of their grain, wore a subdued appearance. Wheat stubble remained as low, stiff bristles across the ground, golden brown under the slanting light of October afternoons. Cornfields, once tall with green stalks, now stood ragged and rustling, their husks dry and brittle, their ears already gathered and carried into bins. Here and there, forgotten ears lay on the ground, left for pigs or birds to find. Bean vines, once climbing and heavy with pods, sagged into shriveled tangles, their usefulness spent. Squash lay harvested and stacked, while the vines that bore them collapsed into pale threads across the soil. The fields were not bare, but they spoke no longer of growth or promise. They spoke of what had been taken, of what the earth had already given, and of what silence remained. Pastures too changed their character. Grass grew sparse, its color paling, its energy diminishing. Animals grazed less vigorously, finding fewer tender shoots. The air carried the faint smell of fallen leaves, their dry bodies gathering in fence lines and corners, crisp beneath boots and hooves. Trees around the fields shifted from deep greens to hues of gold, russet and scarlet, before giving way to emptiness. The horizon itself appeared altered, softer, as foliage thinned and revealed distant lines of hills and forests once concealed by summer's fullness. For the farmer's family, the rhythm of daily tasks changed in kind. Urgency gave way to preparation. The pressing demands of planting, tending and harvesting were replaced by the quieter, steadier duties of making ready for winter. Wood, chopped and stacked, became as important as any barrel of grain or salted pork. In woodlots, men worked with axe and wedge, splitting logs into halves and quarters, piling them into neat stacks that dried in the cool air. The sound of axe against wood rang with regularity, sharp but unhurried, marking the afternoon like a bell. Each log added to the pile was a measure of warmth secured against freezing nights yet to come. The farmhouse itself bore marks of the season's shift. Windows were sealed against drafts with cloth or paper, cracks filled with whatever material could be pressed into service. Thatched roofs, or in some cases wooden shingles, were inspected for leaks. Chimneys were cleaned, their sooty throats scraped and cleared to ensure smoke could rise freely when fires burned strong. The scent of these preparations mingled with the season: wood smoke, drying herbs, the faint sharpness of stored onions. Clothing, too, demanded attention. Summer's lighter wear was folded away, replaced by heavier garments. Wool, linen, and leather were inspected, patched, and mended. Children outgrew clothes quickly, and mothers often reworked garments, letting out seams or cutting down adult wear to fit smaller bodies. Wool stockings were darned, mittens prepared, and cloaks brushed of dust. The slow, repetitive work of spinning, weaving, and sewing filled long evenings by the hearth, the faint light of candles or lanterns illuminating the steady rhythm of hands. Animals, those silent companions of the farm, also faced transition. Cows, sheep, and pigs fed more eagerly, driven by instinct to store strength against winter scarcity. Farmers inspected fences and barns, ensuring that pens were sturdy, that roofs would shield against snow, that straw bedding was laid thick in stalls. Chickens were brought into warmer coops, their numbers diminished by culling, for not every bird could be carried through the winter months. The quiet cull of livestock was a practical act, but it carried a gravity, a reminder that only what was sustainable could be preserved. Beyond the farm, the natural world itself seemed to signal readiness. Birds gathered in restless flocks, moving in great shifting patterns across the sky, their cries echoing faintly against the cool air. Squirrels moved with tireless energy, carrying nuts to hidden caches. The air itself felt altered, crisper, thinner, holding both clarity and chill. Morning frost crept across fields and fences, tracing delicate white crystals that vanished with the rising sun. In streams and ponds water grew colder, its surface reflecting the pale hues of autumn skies. Evenings carried a different weight. The sun set earlier, shadows lengthened, and the farmhouse filled with a dimness that arrived sooner each day. Candles and lanterns were lit, fires built earlier, meals eaten in the soft flicker of flame. Outside, the fields lay in silence, their labors concluded, their shapes resting beneath the growing cold. The family's focus turned inward, toward hearth and table, toward the small circle of warmth that could be held against the expanding dark. Community life, though sparse, also reflected the season. Neighbors sometimes gathered to assist in late tasks, such as butchering livestock or raising additional wood piles. Churches held gatherings in the cooling air, their sermons often heavy with reminders of providence and preparation. Morgues grew quieter, for travel became more difficult in cold and mud. Isolation deepened, but it was not resented. It was understood, part of the rhythm of rural life, a season of inwardness and reserve. There was in the settled autumn a quality of reflection. The farmer might pause at the edge of his field, looking across stubble and fallen leaves, and see not emptiness but completion. The work of the year lay behind him, the fruits of labor stored in barrels and cellars, the house braced against wind and frost. What remained was not to create or to gather, but to endure, to wait through the silence of winter, for the cycle to begin anew. The land itself, resting, mirrored this human posture. No furrows opened, no seed was sown, no growth pushed upward. The earth lay still, breathing slowly beneath the cold sky, its energy turned inward, invisible yet persistent. The settled autumn was neither joyful nor mournful. It was a season of balance, a moment when the farmer and the land stood side by side, their labors suspended, their strength held in reserve. The stubble fields, the stacked wood, the filled cellar, the sealed windows, all these were signs of readiness. The family, gathered at their hearth, listened to the wind moving through bare branches, knowing that winter would test them, but that they had done what could be done. In this way, autumn did not merely pass. It lingered, stretching into the farmer's consciousness, reminding him daily of time's passage, of cycles completed, of endurance to come. And as he lay down in the quiet of his wooden house, the land outside lay with him, resting in silence, awaiting the cold together. When the last leaves had fallen, when fields no longer held even the faintest trace of green, and when the breath of the morning air rose in small white clouds, the farmer and his family knew with certainty that winter was drawing close. The signs were not sudden, but layered, arriving in small increments. The frost that lingered longer in the grass, the thin crust of ice forming along the edges of troughs, the sharp scent of smoke drifting from chimneys each afternoon. The cold did not strike all at once. It approached slowly, steadily, until its presence could no longer be ignored. This season of approach was marked not by planting or harvesting, but by quiet labor meant to seal the household against the elements. The farmhouse, wooden and plain, was no fortress against the wind. Its walls were of timber, its windows of glass panes held in thin frames, its roof thatched or shingled with care, but never entirely secure against drafts. Families moved deliberately through a set of rituals designed to hold the warmth in and keep the cold at bay. Cracks between boards were stuffed with cloth, paper, or moss, pressed into place with careful hands. Doors were fitted more tightly with strips of fabric nailed along their edges. Windows were sometimes covered with oiled paper, a translucent barrier that dimmed the light, but held back the worst of the chill. Curtains of heavy cloth, drawn at dusk, provided an extra layer against the creeping air. None of these measures created perfect warmth, but each slowed the invasion of frost, buying a little more comfort against long nights. At the heart of preparation lay wood. Fire was not only a source of warmth, but the central element of survival in a colonial home. Without steady fires, meals could not be cooked, water could not be kept from freezing, and bodies could not be shielded from the cold's steady advance. Thus, the chopping of wood took on the weight of necessity, a task repeated day after day, as autumn waned. In woodlots and clearings, men swung axes into logs with measured rhythm. The sound echoed through crisp air, ringing against the trunks of bare trees. Logs split along their grain, falling into neat halves and quarters, which were then stacked in precise rows, bark side down to shed rain and snow. These stacks grew tall, long walls of fuel lined beside barns, or under lean tos, their orderliness a silent reassurance. Each log was a fragment of winter conquered in advance, each pile a fortress of warmth waiting to be released. Children gathered smaller branches, carried bundles of kindling, or cleared chips from around the chopping block. The labor was steady, unhurried, yet unceasing. Every household knew that too little wood meant hardship, and that abundance of grain or meat mattered little if the hearth could not be kept alight. The family worked together, shoulders bent, hands red from the cold, until the piles reached a height that gave confidence for the months ahead. Inside, fires were tended with increasing regularity. The great hearth in the main room became the household's anchor, its flames providing both light and warmth. Stones at its base grew warm and held the heat even after flames had died. Ashes were carefully raked, embers preserved overnight, beneath layers of coals, ready to be stirred back into life each morning. Smoke drifted upward through chimneys, carrying with it the scent of oak, hickory, or pine, mingling with the air above the farmstead. The act of setting fires was not taken lightly. Every flame was guarded, every ember preserved. Fire starting was laborious, relying on flint, steel, and tinder, a process far from effortless. To let the fire die completely was to invite cold into the house, to risk shivering through hours of darkness until new sparks could be coaxed into flame. For this reason, women tended the hearth with constant attention, feeding logs at intervals, adjusting coals, shifting pots and kettles to catch or avoid the direct heat. As the cold drew nearer, life contracted toward the hearth. Chairs and benches were drawn close. Tables moved nearer to the warmth. Tools, boots, and garments were left to dry in its circle of heat after work in the damp fields or woods. Shadows flickered on walls as the fire crackled, casting a shifting light that was at once comforting and unchanging. The hearth was not only physical protection, but a kind of spiritual center, the place around which the family gathered, worked, and endured. Other tasks of readiness filled the days. Straw was laid thick in animal stalls, so livestock would not suffer the bitter nights. Wells were checked, their wooden covers secured, to prevent freezing or contamination. Wagons and plows, no longer in use, were cleaned and stored, sheltered as best they could be under barns or sheds. Tools, once essential each day, were oiled and hung on walls, waiting for spring's return. These small acts gave the farmstead the air of a place drawing inward, folding itself against the oncoming season. The cold's approach was not without beauty. Frost-painted windows in delicate patterns, feathery and crystalline, each morning offering new shapes. The air smelled sharper, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. Skies cleared, revealing stars with unusual brightness, as if the cold sharpened their edges. The moon rose pale and distant, illuminating bare trees that stood like black silhouettes against silver fields, yet the beauty was tempered by vigilance. Each evening, as the last logs were stacked on the fire, the family knew that warmth was temporary, held only as long as fuel remained. The wind pressed against walls, rattled shutters, slipped through cracks. The knowledge that the cold would deepen, that snow would soon fall and remain, hung silently in every preparation. Autumn's labors had been about abundance, about gathering and preserving. The labors of the cold's approach were about endurance, about strengthening the household's defenses, about guarding what had been gathered. In this way, the farmer's family stood between two seasons. Behind them, the richness of fields and orchards; before them, the silence of winter and its trials. And so, with each day that grew shorter, with each night that grew colder, they set another layer of readiness in place. Another log split, another crack sealed, another ember stirred. It was not dramatic labor, nor was it marked by triumph. It was the slow, deliberate rhythm of survival, as steady as the ticking of time itself, as certain as the cold wind pressing at the farmhouse door. When winter at last closed its hand over the land, evenings lengthened into a stillness that seemed without end. The sun set early, slipping behind bare trees while the day was still young, and by late afternoon shadows stretched long across the frozen ground. Inside the farmhouse, the family turned inward to face the season's greatest test, not the labor of survival alone, but the endurance of time itself, measured out in slow hours beneath the hush of snow. Snowfall blanketed the fields in heavy silence, muting the world beyond recognition. Fences were reduced to dark lines buried in drifts, barns rose like solemn shapes out of whiteness, and paths disappeared beneath soft layers that hid their familiar tracks. The sound of footsteps on snow carried clearly, crunching and crisp, but beyond that noise the air was still. The landscape seemed to sleep, and within that sleep, the farmhouse stood as a fragile island of warmth. Evenings gathered quickly, and within the house, candles were lit one by one. Their flames were small but steady, glowing against the dim interior. Made of tallow, or beeswax, they carried their own distinct scents, the faint sharpness of animal fat, or the softer sweetness of wax. Their light was not bright but flickering, a golden shimmer that illuminated only what was near. Beyond the circle of candlelight, corners of rooms sank into shadow, objects barely discernible, edges blurred by gloom. At the hearth, the fire burned strong, its logs crackling as they released their stored heat. The glow of flames joined with candlelight, softening the room with warmth and movement. Against this backdrop, the family settled into evening work, quiet tasks that filled hours without requiring haste. Winter evenings were not idle, but their labor carried a slower rhythm, unhurried and repetitive, suited to the long stretches of darkness. Spinning was among the most constant of these tasks. Women sat at wheels or distaffs, twisting fibers into thread, their hands moving with practiced steadiness. The hum of the spinning wheel filled the silence, a low, continuous sound that was almost soothing. Each turn of the wheel, each length of yarn produced, was part of the endless cycle of providing cloth for garments, blankets, and coverings. The fibers themselves, wool from sheep shorn in summer, flax retted and prepared in autumn, carried with them the memory of earlier seasons, now transformed into thread, to guard against the cold. Nearby, garments were mended, stockings were darned, shirts patched, mittens sewn with new stitches where old seams had frayed. Each piece of clothing represented hours of labor already invested, and so nothing was discarded lightly. Children's clothing especially demanded constant adjustment, for they grew quickly, outpacing the fabric's durability. Mothers cut down larger garments, reshaped them with patient care, ensuring that cloth stretched as far as possible. These tasks were not glamorous, but they were vital, their quiet rhythm suited to evenings when outside work lay buried beneath snow. The household's men, too, found their occupations in winter evenings. Tools were inspected, sharpened and repaired. Axes were honed, blades polished, handles replaced where cracks had formed. Harnesses for animals were mended, leather softened and stitched. Wooden implements, rakes, yokes, barrels, were examined, tightened or reshaped. In these small acts, the work of spring was already being prepared, for though the land slept, the farmer's responsibilities extended beyond the present moment. Children gathered in the warm circle of the hearth, engaged in tasks suited to their skill. Some wound spun thread onto spindles, others shelled dried corn or sorted beans. Younger children played with small wooden toys, whittled by their fathers, or listened to stories told in the flicker of firelight. Education, too, found its place in long evenings, as parents guided children through their first letters, reading from the Bible, or from worn almanacs. By the dim light of a candle, words took shape slowly, each syllable part of a patient learning that matched the pace of the season. The silence outside was deep, broken only by the occasional cry of wind across eaves, or the distant crack of ice along rivers and ponds. Snow pressed against walls, muffling sound, making the world beyond the window seem farther away than it truly was. Sometimes, wolves or foxes might be heard in the distance, their voices faint against the frozen air, but even these reminders of wilderness carried no urgency, for the farmhouse remained closed and guarded. Food prepared and stored in autumn was now brought forth in careful portions. Salted meat was boiled to soften its toughness, dried beans simmered slowly, cornmeal baked into bread, or stirred into porridge. Apples, drawn from barrels, appeared in stews or baked into pies. These meals were plain, yet nourishing, their flavors shaped by preservation more than freshness. The smell of cooking filled the air, mingling with wood smoke, becoming the scent of winter itself. Time in winter was measured differently. Days seemed shorter, yet evenings stretched without end, as if darkness stretched time into longer shapes. Families spoke little, their voices subdued, their movements softened by the stillness around them. Hours were marked by the turning of the spinning wheel, the snapping of a log in the fire, or the dripping of melted wax from a candle. To pace was not one of urgency, but of endurance. Each night lived through as part of a chain leading towards spring. Occasionally, neighbors might gather, braving the snow to share in work or fellowship. Quilting bees, small gatherings of sewing or spinning, brought women together in warmth and quiet conversation. Men exchanged news, or assisted in heavy tasks, their presence a reminder that even in isolation, community lingered. But most evenings remained within the family's circle, defined by the intimacy of shared labor and the silence of the snow-covered world beyond. For the farmer, winter evenings carried a dual weight, both rest and vigilance. The fields required no tending, yet the hearth demanded constancy. Fires could not be allowed to fade. Food had to be rationed with care, tools kept ready. Beneath the surface of quiet was the knowledge that winter tested endurance as surely as harvest tested strength. To keep the household warm, fed and intact was as significant as any sowing or reaping. Thus the long winter evenings unfolded, one after another, marked not by dramatic events, but by repetition. Spinning, mending, tending, cooking, each task a thread woven into the fabric of survival. Outside the snow lay heavy, the sky stretched pale and cold, the stars sharp against the dark. Inside the farmhouse glowed faintly, a circle of warmth surrounded by silence, and within that circle, the farmer's family endured, their lives carried forward by the steady rhythm of small, patient labors, as constant as the turning of the seasons themselves. Life in the colonial countryside was not only shaped by the land and the seasons, but also by the spaces that separated one household from another. The farmer's world, so often measured by the boundaries of his fields and the walls of his home, was at the same time defined by the long distances that stretched outward, linking his existence to others in a pattern of remoteness and occasional convergence. Community was present, but it did not press itself daily into view, rather it emerged in intervals, quiet but essential, woven into the rhythm of weeks and seasons. Farms were set apart by necessity, each family's claim staked on parcels of cleared ground surrounded by woods, streams, and the remnants of wilderness. Between homesteads lay stretches of forest paths, rough wagon tracks, or simple cart ruts worn into the earth. These distances, measured by hours of walking, or by the slow pace of an ox-drawn sled, created a natural solitude. A man might see smoke rising from a neighbor's chimney on the far edge of a hill, yet not speak to him for weeks at a time. The sheer geography of the land encouraged separation, making every meeting carry the weight of significance. Yet despite the solitude, human beings sought each other, and so patterns of gathering formed. Chief among these were the gatherings for worship, when families left their homes, bundled against the cold or dust, to travel to a church that often served as the center of their social world. The journey itself could be long, miles on foot, or with horse and wagon along uneven ground. In winter, the roads were narrowed by snow, forcing travelers to walk or ride in single tracks, while in spring they were softened to mud, slowing progress to a crawl. Nevertheless, these journeys were made, for attendance was expected, and community depended upon shared worship. The meeting house stood at the heart of this ritual, usually plain in its design, built of wood with unadorned walls and simple pews. It was less a place of grandeur than of collective presence. Families entered quietly, sitting in order, men and women often separated, their breath visible in the cold air during winter services, when fires could not keep pace with the chill. The minister's voice carried through the room, solemn and steady, shaping not only spiritual guidance, but also the moral framework of communal life. For many it was the only time in the week when they would see neighbors beyond their own family, a reminder that theirs was not a solitary existence, even if it often felt so. Beyond worship, church days functioned as rare opportunities for conversation. Outside, after the service ended, small clusters of people gathered, speaking in low tones about weather, crops, illnesses, or local concerns. Children saw their friends, trading laughter, or small games, before being called to order for the return journey home. Information traveled in these moments. News from distant towns, reports of colonial assemblies, or even word of conflict brewing in places far away. These exchanges bound the scattered farms together, weaving a fragile but necessary fabric of community across distance. Other gatherings were fewer, but still notable. In autumn, communal tasks such as barn raisings or harvest cooperatives drew families together, each household contributing labor in turn. These occasions, though practical, carried the unspoken weight of fellowship, for no farm could stand entirely alone. When a new barn was needed, or when a harvest threatened to overwhelm a single family, neighbors appeared with tools and strength, their combined efforts transforming days of solitary work into hours of shared labor. Such gatherings did not erase the separations of distance, but they bridged them, at least briefly, with a sense of common purpose. Even in times of need, distance shaped interaction. When illness struck, or when a farm faced loss, help could not be summoned immediately. A rider or messenger might take hours to reach another household, and longer still to return with aid. The knowledge of this delay hung over every family, reminding them of both their reliance on one another and the isolation that made that reliance precarious. Communities survived because of their willingness to endure such gaps, to step in when called upon, but the call itself was never swift, and often it came too late. During winter, the challenge of distance grew heavier. Snow closed roads, drifts blocked paths, and families might go weeks without seeing another soul outside their household. The world shrank to the confines of the farm, with the rare sound of sleigh bells, or a neighbor's sled across frozen ground breaking the monotony. On such occasions, a visit carried the weight of rarity, its memory lingering long after the caller had departed. Even the briefest exchange of words, a gift of food, or the loan of a tool, became part of the household's store of endurance. More than a luxury, nearly a necessity. The rhythms of isolation were tempered, too, by awareness of broader communities that stretched beyond the immediate countryside. Market towns, though distant, represented points of connection to a larger colonial world. Farmers might make journeys of several days to sell surplus crops, trade for tools, or purchase goods not made at home. These trips were infrequent, perhaps once or twice a season, but they carried back stories, objects, and impressions that refreshed the otherwise repetitive cycles of life. In this way, distance was both an obstacle and a link, for it preserved solitude, but also made each connection weightier, each arrival and return significant. Children grew within this world of separation, their friendships shaped by the rare occasions of church, gatherings, or market days. Playmates might live miles apart, making their meetings treasured events rather than daily routines. Bonds were forged not through abundance of contact, but through the scarcity of it, giving relationships a depth rooted in anticipation and memory. The sense of distance, present even in childhood, formed a part of their understanding of community, teaching them early that human connection was not constant, but precious precisely because it was rare. In all this, the colonial farmer's experience of community was one of balance. Solitude was constant, yet it was never absolute. Connections came through intervals, the weekly gathering, the seasonal labor, the occasional visit, each one enough to remind the household that it belonged to something larger than itself. The distances between farms, though broad, were not empty, for they carried within them the quiet understanding that others lived and worked in parallel, enduring the same winters, harvesting the same fields, praying under the same roof. Thus, community in the colonial countryside was not measured by proximity, but by endurance across separation. It was not the closeness of daily contact, but the reassurance of shared existence scattered across miles of woods and fields. When neighbors met, when voices carried in the cold air outside the meeting house, when labor was shared, or when word from beyond the hills arrived, each event reaffirmed a truth. The farmer's life, though solitary in appearance, was bound to others by necessity, by faith, and by the simple resilience of people who understood both the weight of distance and the quiet strength of fellowship. For the colonial farmer, time was not measured in the quick succession of hours as it is today, but in broader, slower rhythms that followed the steady pulse of nature. Days lengthened and shortened with the seasons, tasks unfolded in their proper order, and the farmer's world was oriented not by clocks, but by cycles. Each moment carried significance only in relation to what had been done before, and what must be done next. The measurement of time was a matter of survival, for without a careful awareness of the year's passage, the land could not be coaxed into yielding its provisions. The farmhouse itself contained few instruments of time. A family might own a simple sundial, perhaps placed in a garden, or a hanging clock if fortune allowed, though many could not afford such devices. Instead, the greater reliance was placed upon the sky, upon light and shadow, upon the observable markers of dawn and dusk. The rising sun determined the beginning of labor, and the sinking sun its end, with little reference to exact hours. Candles extended the evening into productive time, but even then the sense of duration was imprecise, shaped by the melting of wax rather than the ticking of a mechanism. More reliable than clocks were calendars, often printed in almanacs that circulated widely across the colonies. These slim books, cheaply made and eagerly used, offered not only the enumeration of days and months, but also guidance on planting and harvesting, forecasts of weather, astronomical observations and moral advice. Farmers consulted these pages with respect, marking the progression of the year, noting the timing of equinoxes and solstices, and seeking direction on when best to sow corn, when to shear sheep, or when to expect the first frost. The almanac was not a luxury, but a necessity, its predictions and charts forming part of the shared culture of rural life. The most famous of these, such as Poor Richard's Almanac published by Benjamin Franklin, combined practical information with wit and aphorism, its sayings remembered long after the year's calendar had passed. But beyond Franklin's celebrated work, countless local almanacs circulated, produced by printers in towns and cities, each adapted to the climate and needs of its readers. Within their pages, the colonial farmer found a map of the year, a framework within which to order his own labors. Though predictions were imperfect, and weather often defied expectation, the almanac remained a constant companion, its worn pages consulted by candlelight in long winter evenings, or carried in a pocket to the field. Yet even without printed guides, the farmer was trained by necessity to read the signs of nature as a kind of living calendar. Buds on trees, the call of certain birds, the emergence of insects, the angle of the sun, and the scent of the soil. All these became signals more precise than any printed page. The farmer knew when the frost had left the ground by the softness beneath his boots, when it was time to sow by the swelling of buds on maples, when hay must be cut by the height of grass, and when winter approached by the restlessness of animals preparing for cold. These were lessons learned not from books alone, but from long observation, passed down from father to son, from mother to daughter, until they became ingrained knowledge, guiding hands as surely as any calendar. The moon, too, served as a measure of time. Farmers marked its phases, noting the best times for planting, harvesting, or even cutting timber. Folklore intertwined with practice, suggesting that tasks performed under certain phases would prosper more than others. though modern science would cast doubt on such beliefs. In the colonial world they provided a structure, offering reassurance in a life where much depended on forces beyond control. The waxing and waning of the moon became part of the rhythm of the farmer's year, a silent companion overhead, unerring in its cycles, even when the weather betrayed expectation. The seasons themselves were the grand markers of time. Spring carried the urgency of sowing, summer the care of growing, autumn the labor of harvest, and winter the endurance of preservation. Each season contained within it a host of tasks that demanded order. The farmer did not think in abstract weeks or months, but in terms of planting season, haying time, harvest days, or the months of deep cold. In this way time was circular, repeating itself each year, familiar yet never entirely the same. The passage of one season into another was both a reassurance and a reminder that life moved forward, carrying the family with it. Festivals and holy days offered another rhythm, not merely spiritual but temporal, punctuating the year with moments of gathering. Sundays marked by worship broke the monotony of labor, carving the week into a predictable shape. Larger observances, harvest celebrations, Christmas, Easter, provided fixed points within the cycle, giving both children and adults a sense of anticipation. These events were rare enough to be memorable, and so they helped anchor time, transforming the endless succession of days into a pattern of meaning. Children growing within this framework measured time differently still. They remembered years not by dates but by events. The winter when the snow reached the windowsills, the summer of abundant apples, the autumn when the barn was raised. Their sense of passing years was tied to changes in their own height, their outgrown garments, or the tasks they were newly trusted to perform. For them as for their parents, time was not abstract but lived, experienced through seasons, through labor, and through memory. Illness and mortality, too, marked time's passage. Families remembered the year when sickness struck, when a grave was dug in frozen ground, when the minister spoke solemnly of endurance and faith. These moments stood out in the otherwise steady flow of repetition, breaking the cycle with sharp edges. Yet even these events were woven into the greater rhythm of life, for the community returned to its routines, and the seasons continued their unbroken march. Time did not pause for grief. It carried all forward, as relentless as the turning of the earth. Thus, the colonial farmer's understanding of time was layered. It was at once celestial, drawn from the heavens, natural, read in the signs of earth and sky, and practical, structured by books, calendars, and almanacs. It was slow, patient, and cyclical, resistant to haste, measured by labor and survival, rather than by minutes and seconds. Time did not rush, nor did it halt, but moved with steady inevitability, carrying one season into the next, one generation after another, until the past and future blurred into the enduring rhythm of the present. And so, as the farmer sat by candlelight in winter, or as he rose with the dawn in summer, his awareness of time was neither hurried nor abstract. It was the soft unfolding of nature's cycles, the quiet authority of printed pages, the remembered wisdom of those who came before. It was not a clock ticking on a wall, but the slow passage of light across a field, the first call of a bird in spring, the last harvest gathered before frost. Time, in its passing, was not something he counted, but something he lived. The farmhouse was not only a place of labor and survival, but also a place of learning. In its wooden rooms, warmed by the hearth, and surrounded by fields that stretched outward in every direction, children grew into their roles within the family and the larger community. Their education was not swift, nor was it formal for most. Instead, it was gradual, steady, and woven into the rhythms of daily life. Learning was not separated from work, but bound to it, emerging in small tasks, in repetition, in observation, and in the patient guidance of parents and elders. From an early age, children were drawn into the household's labor. At first their responsibilities were light, gathering eggs from the chicken coop, fetching kindling for the fire, carrying small buckets of water from the well, or helping to weed the garden beside the house. These tasks were suited to their strength and ability, but they were more than chores. They were lessons in responsibility, teaching children that survival was a shared endeavor, and that even the smallest hands could contribute. Dissatisfaction of completing such tasks, however simple, became their first step toward independence. Teaching was never hurried. Parents understood that children learned not by instruction alone, but by imitation. A child watched his father sharpen a tool, or his mother spin flax into thread, and through repeated exposure, absorbed not only the movements, but also the patience required. The farmhouse itself was a classroom, its walls echoing with the hum of spinning wheels, the crackle of fires, the steady rhythm of chores. In this environment, learning unfolded slowly, naturally, as children copied what they saw and practiced until clumsiness gave way to competence. Pacing was central. A boy might spend weeks learning to guide the plow horse in straight lines, his father correcting his grip, his steps, his posture. A girl might sit beside her mother, attempting to sew straight stitches on rough cloth, pulling out crooked lines to begin again. There was no expectation of speed, no illusion that mastery could be reached quickly. Instead, progress was measured in small improvements, in the steady transformation of tasks once impossible into tasks performed with ease. The sense of parents was matched by the patience demanded of children, both understanding that the only path to skill was persistence. Formal schooling, when it existed, was limited. In some communities, schools were established, often one-room buildings where children gathered under the guidance of a single teacher. Instruction was basic: reading, writing, arithmetic, and most importantly, religious knowledge. For many, however, such schools were distant, and attendance irregular, shaped by the needs of the farm. During planting and harvest, children might remain at home, their labor too valuable to be spared. Learning to read might therefore take years, with progress marked not by grades or terms, but by the slow unfolding of letters on a page. Read aloud by candlelight at the family table. Books were few, and most often limited to the Bible, psalm books, or almanacs. These texts provided both instruction and moral guidance, shaping not only literacy but worldview. Children stumbled over verses, sounding out words, while parents corrected with quiet firmness. The act of reading was as much a religious duty as a practical skill, for understanding scripture was considered essential. Writing, meanwhile, was learned through careful copying. Letters formed slowly on scraps of paper or slates, each stroke requiring attention. The slowness of the process reinforced its gravity. Literacy was not assumed, and so each new word mastered was a small achievement. For girls, education extended into domestic crafts, each one essential for the household survival. They learned to card wool, to spin, to weave, to cook, to preserve food, and to tend younger siblings. Instruction came through demonstration, repetition, and correction. There was little distinction between learning and working, for the tasks themselves were both. To know how to mend a shirt, or how to churn butter, was to possess knowledge as valuable as reading, for it directly sustained the family. Their lessons were unending, each day offering practice, each season presenting new demands. Boys, similarly, were trained in farming skills, their tasks expanding as they grew. At first they might drive the cows to pasture, carry grain, or watch over younger animals. Later they would learn to handle tools, to split logs, to sow seed, to guide the plow, and to care for livestock. Each new responsibility was entrusted slowly, a measure of maturity as much as ability. By the time they reached adolescence, they were expected to perform nearly as much as grown men, their training complete, not through lectures, but through years of steady work beside their fathers. Learning was therefore both practical and moral. Patience, humility, obedience, and endurance were as important as skill with a tool or knowledge of a letter. Parents taught not only how to complete a task, but how to approach it with steadiness and respect. Laziness was corrected, mistakes noted and amended, but always with the understanding that learning was a process measured in years, not days. The household valued perseverance, for it mirrored the larger truth of farming itself, that crops did not grow overnight, nor did children become capable adults without time and diligence. Winter evenings offered space for further teaching. By candlelight, children practiced reading or sewing, while parents guided with gentle persistence. The dim glow, the steady crackle of firewood, the long stretch of hours, all provided an atmosphere suited to slow progress. The season of rest from the fields became a season of study within the home, where lessons repeated night after night sank slowly into memory. The very slowness of these evenings became part of the learning process, shaping children to endure repetition, to value patience, and to accept that progress was always gradual. Play was not absent, but even play often carried within it seeds of learning. Children imitated their parents' work, fashioning miniature plows, spinning wheels, or dolls dressed in scraps of cloth. In these games they rehearsed the roles they would later assume, transforming play into preparation. The boundaries between learning, work, and play were faint, blending into a single continuum that defined their upbringing. As the years passed, the accumulation of these lessons became visible. A girl once clumsy at the spinning wheel produced smooth thread. A boy once timid with animals handled the oxen with confidence. Their growth was measured less in inches than in competence, in the gradual transfer of responsibility from parent to child. By the time they reached adulthood, their training was complete, not through sudden instruction, but through the endless patience of repetition, lived out in the farmhouse and on the land. Thus the education of children in the colonial countryside was not hurried, nor fragmented. It was whole, steady, and slow, unfolding with the seasons, bound to the rhythms of work and faith. Learning was not an interruption of life, but its constant companion, shaping children into adults through tasks repeated, mistakes corrected, and lessons absorbed over time. In this world, knowledge was not given but earned, cultivated like the fields themselves, demanding patience and rewarding persistence. The colonial year was not a straight road, but a wheel, always turning, always carrying life back to its familiar stations. Winter, for all its length and heaviness, never lasted forever. There came a point, quiet, tentative, almost imperceptible at first, when the world gave its first small signs that the long season of cold had reached its slow conclusion. The farmer, who had endured through silence, through repetition, and through endurance, began to lift his eyes once more toward the land, sensing its quiet readiness. Snow, which had lain heavy on the fields and draped the roofs of barns for months, began to soften. At first, it receded only slightly, forming hollows where the sun struck most directly. Patches of dark earth appeared along fence lines and beneath the branches of trees. The sound of dripping water became the first herald of change, as icicles surrendered to warmth and streams swelled with meltwater. Each drop carried with it the promise of renewal, though the ground remained frozen beneath. Inside the farmhouse, the change was felt just as surely. Fires burned less fiercely in the hearth, for the bitterest cold had passed, though the woodpile was still kept close at hand. Windows, once sealed tightly against drafts, were opened slightly on milder days, allowing fresh air to enter, carrying with it the faint scent of thawing soil. The oppressive stillness of long winter evenings gave way to earlier light in the morning, and longer hours of day, gently reshaping the rhythm of labor within the house. The animals, too, stirred with the season's shift. Cattle lowed more insistently, restless in their stalls, sensing the nearness of pasture. Chickens began to scratch more eagerly, responding to the lengthening days by laying more eggs. Horses, confined for months to minimal use, stamped their hooves with impatience, ready to pull plows once more across softened ground. In their movements, the farmer saw confirmation that the year was turning, that the household's vigilance had carried them through. For the farmer himself, early spring was a season of both relief and anticipation. Relief came from the lessening burden of cold, from the knowledge that food stores had endured, and from the simple comfort of standing in sunlight that carried warmth again. But anticipation was stronger still, for every thawing patch of soil was a reminder of the work to come. The ground that had lain dormant was once again the central concern, its readiness dictating the tasks of weeks ahead. Plows were inspected, seed stores reviewed, and plans revisited for the planting of fields. Winter had offered pause, but now the earth demanded attention once more. The fields, as snow withdrew, presented a bleak but hopeful sight. The stubble of last year's crops lay flattened, pressed by months of ice, while fences leaned from the weight of drifts. Stones worked up by frost, dotted the surface, demanding removal before the plough could cut clean furrows. Water pooled in low places, forming temporary marshes that reflected the pale sky. Yet within this seeming disorder was the quiet assurance of renewal. The soil once thawed would accept seed again, and the cycle of growth would begin as it always had. Natural signs guided the farmer's readiness. The swelling of buds on trees, the calls of returning birds, the greening of grasses along sheltered slopes, all indicated the approach of planting time. Almanacs consulted once more, provided dates for expected frosts and recommendations for sowing. But the farmer trusted as much to his own observations as to printed words. He had watched the land for years, and he knew that no calendar could replace the signs carried in wind, water, and soil. Children felt the change as keenly as their parents. Freed from the confinement of winter, they ventured outside to play in the melting snow, their boots sinking deep into the mud, their laughter echoing against the barns. Their chores shifted too, moving once more into the fields and gardens. Buckets of water were carried more frequently as animals required more. Fences were repaired in preparation for grazing, and seeds were sorted, their small forms held in eager hands that only half understood the significance of what they carried. For them spring was excitement, though its true weight rested on the shoulders of their parents. The farmhouse itself echoed with renewal. Windows were washed, floors scrubbed, tools set in order. The residue of winter, ashes, soot, the lingering smell of smoke was cleared away. Just as the earth was being readied for planting, so the house was readied for a new cycle of life. Women planned their gardens, selecting herbs and vegetables that would grow beside the dwelling. Barrels were checked to see what food remained, and meals adjusted to stretch the last of winter's stores until the freshness of spring could supply the table again. This turning of the year was not marked by celebration or sudden joy, but by quiet recognition. Farmers did not rush, for they knew the dangers of acting too soon. A late frost could undo premature planting, and wet soil could ruin seeds not yet ready to sprout. Instead, the pace was deliberate, guided by caution and memory. The year did not lurch forward but turned with steady inevitability, each task unfolding in its time. Neighbors, when they met, spoke of the same signs. Was the frost truly gone from the ground? Had the maples begun to run with sap? Did the geese fly north in greater numbers this week? These shared observations bound the community together in expectation. The silence of winter, when visits had been rare, now gave way to conversation, to cautious planning, to a sense of common readiness. The turning of the year was not felt by one family alone, but by all who lived within reach of the same soil. Thus, the farmer looked once more toward the earth, seeing in its thawing surface both the end of one cycle and the beginning of another. The year had turned, as it always did, bringing with it the same labors, the same uncertainties, and the same promise of survival. Winter's grip had loosened, snow had melted, and the land, patient in its dormancy, prepared again to bear the weight of seed and harvest. For the farmer, this was the eternal reassurance that no matter how heavy the snow, no matter how long the cold, the year always turned again, and life was renewed in the soil beneath his feet. The story of the colonial farmer was not one of sudden changes or dramatic turns, but of continuity, of seasons passing in predictable procession, and of the land remaining constant through each shift. From the pale dawns of spring to the dusky evenings of winter, the earth stood as both taskmaster and companion, asking much but offering sustenance in return. To live upon it was to accept its terms, to move in rhythm with its patterns, and to find within its constancy a form of stability rare in other aspects of life. As the year folded once more into spring, and as fields prepared again to receive the seed, the farmer looked upon the soil with a gaze shaped by familiarity. This was not new ground, though frost and snow had concealed it for months. It was the same soil turned by his plough last year, the same earth that bore his wheat, his corn and his beans. It had been resting, but it had not changed in its essence. Its stones would rise each year to be cleared, its furrows would welcome seed each spring, and its bounty would sustain him through yet another cycle of survival. The land carried memory, though it was not written in books or records. It held the lines of furrows past, the worn paths where footsteps had repeated year upon year, the shadow of old fences, the faint depressions where barns once stood and were replaced. It bore the traces of storms endured, of droughts survived, of floods receding, yet through all this, it remained what it had always been, the constant companion of those who lived upon it. Unlike markets, politics, or distant wars, the soil did not shift suddenly with human will. Its changes were slow, measured, bound to the rhythm of nature itself. For the farmer, this constancy was both burden and comfort. The burden lay in the repetition, the unending call of labor that never ceased to demand his strength. There was no final harvest after which he might rest entirely, no ultimate task after which his work was done. Each year mirrored the last, carrying him forward in a pattern as old as the land itself. Yet within that repetition lay comfort. He knew what to expect, what must be done, and what the earth required of him. The soil did not betray him with novelty. Its demands were known, and its rewards, though never guaranteed, were steady enough to sustain hope. The farmhouse, standing at the edge of these fields, was itself part of this constancy. Its timbers, darkened with age and smoke, held the warmth of countless winters. Its floorboards bore the scuff of boots, the tread of children grown tall, the hush of evenings when only the fire broke the silence. Around it, gardens sprouted each spring, barns filled and emptied with the year's stores, and fences leaned and were righted again. The dwelling, humble in its design, echoed the life of the soil, unchanging in essence, marked by repetition, yet always sufficient. Seasons, though distinct, flowed one into another with seamless inevitability. Spring brought planting, summer brought growth, autumn brought harvest, and winter brought endurance. Then, without fail, spring returned, and the cycle began anew. There was no true beginning, just as there was no final end, only turning, always turning. The farmer's children would one day inherit the same soil, bending their backs over the same furrows, repeating the same motions of sowing, tending, and reaping. Generations passed, but the rhythm held, steady as the slow pull of the plough through fresh earth. Even in moments of stillness, the land asserted its presence. When the farmer stood at his doorway in the early dawn, watching mist settle low over the fields, he did not see emptiness. He saw continuity, the promise that the same ground he had worked yesterday would be worked again tomorrow. When snow lay unbroken over the earth, he did not see death but rest, a pause before renewal. Each view of the land reminded him that his life, and the lives of those before and after him, were bound to the soil's enduring patience. The colonial world beyond the farm might shift. Towns grew, ships arrived from across the ocean, governments issued decrees and collected taxes. Yet for the farmer, these matters touched only lightly upon the core of existence. Crops still needed sowing, animals still needed feeding, firewood still needed chopping. While empires debated and merchants bartered, the soil carried on as it always had, indifferent to such affairs. In this, the farmer found a kind of perspective that his truest labor was not to chase the shifting concerns of men but to remain in step with the land beneath him. The constancy of the land also shaped time itself. Calendars and almanacs offered structure, yet the real measure of life was seen in the slow transformation of the fields. Buds breaking on branches, wheat turning from green to gold, leaves falling and returning to earth. These were the truest clocks. They told the farmer what to do, when to act, and how to prepare. The passage of years was not marked by distant events, but by the familiar cycle of growth and decay repeated endlessly around him. In reflecting on this rhythm, the farmer might sense both the limits and the depths of his life. He would never be rich, never leave behind monuments of stone or records of grandeur. His name might not survive in books or be spoken in distant cities. Yet his labor ensured the survival of his family, the feeding of his community, and the quiet continuation of life upon the soil. His significance was written not in words but in furrows ploughed, seeds sown and harvests gathered, all in concert with the land that never failed to receive him. And so, as one year ended and another began, the farmer returned always to the same beginning, standing before the land, steady in its presence, ready once again to yield to its rhythm. The soil was constant, the seasons were constant, and within that constancy lay the meaning of his days. He had no need to search for novelty or change, for the land itself was sufficient. It was both challenge and sustenance, both demand and gift. It was in the truest sense his companion, as it had been for those before him, and as it would be for those who followed. Thus the cycle closed, only to open again. The farmer, his family, his tools, his animals, his small wooden house, all were bound to the steady, unchanging rhythm of the soil. The land awaited his labor as it always had, and he in turn accepted its call. The wheel of the year turned once more, not with urgency, not with surprise, but with the same calm inevitability that defined his life. In that turning, he found both continuity and peace. The land, constant and unyielding, was his true companion, and with it, the story began again, just as it always had, and always would.